to the cloud. And it's happening, and I hope it's correct. Okay, so we've got our first speakers this morning are with us from Everag from multiple places in the country. We got one came in from Chicago, one from upstate New York, and one that drove up from Charlotte. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves. I think they're going to tag team. I'll fill up your presentation, and yeah, we'll get started.
Thanks, Brittany. How's everyone doing today? Good. A little bit warmer down here than home. I got about 2 feet of snow and sub-zero temperatures, so it's like a heat wave. So thanks for having me. I appreciate it. My name is Bryce Windecker. My family had a 100 cow dairy recently. Just sold that. I still have 20 dairy cows at a neighboring farm. So I work with Everag during the day doing commodity risk management. I specialize in dairy, beef, and local feed markets. And then also have a head, I guess we have 40 head of beef now, and then raise heifers and do crops with that. So that's a little bit about me. And
yeah, my name's Owen Tavelli. I grew up in Colorado on a dairy farm and moved out to Chicago and now work for Everag. I focus on dairy and beef as well, and I'm full time in the Chicago office. It's also, as you can tell, pretty warm here for me.
And then we also have Alyssa. She keeps us in line with organization and paperwork. So appreciate it, Alyssa.
I'm just here to learn, so that's fine for me.
But yeah, to kick it off with the cattle markets, no shock to anyone whether you're getting a day old calf check or selling feeder calves from brood cows at home. Just off of the recent highs, our president would like to say he did us a huge favor. Either way, it's very contradicting what he's been saying, but as you can see, we busted well above the old 2014 highs there. Have done nothing but gone up since the time of COVID there, and there's always uncertainty around the market. So we'll kind of do a brief overview of what where cattle markets currently sit with overall economic dynamics, and kind of dive into what we can do about it to extend the system.
And Vanna's trying. Hang on. We're not using the normal computer. All right, hang on.
No worries.
What is happening? Go. This is where you do a dance. I tried to prepare you for that. No, I'm just kidding. Okay.
Sweet. So does anyone know what managed money is, or familiar with that? So
It's gonna be interactive today, just so y'all know. Even in the back.
Within the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, it's basically futures contracts are nothing more than just a piece of paper, or you can think of it as a stock that's based on the value of a physical commodity. And within that, you have hedge funds that pool money together from different retirement funds, or different people interested in trading that. And these are speculators within the market. They're not a producer. They're not someone buying an animal. They're just simply betting on which way the price may go. And the government, when they're not shut down and off for 45 days, they report to us what those positions are. And the it's nice to see which direction they are buying in, so then you can kind of use that to see which direction the market may go next. Feeder cattle and fed steers and the fed cattle all settle to a cash market index. So the one for feeder cattle would be the CME Feeder Cattle Index. That's a 12-state area average from basically Montana all the way down to Texas, kind of in that western center part of the state where it's mostly cow country. And they take the area average of all those different sale barns that report to that. and get a daily index, and then they do the average of that, and that's how that settles. And then for fed cattle, would you want to explain the 5 area one?
Oh, yeah. So fed, it's very similar to the feeder cattle index. Fed cattle settles the same way, except with that contract, there is delivery of live cattle. When I started working at Everag, I thought that there would be delivery of milk to you if you took a contracted delivery. I was wrong on that one. But with the 5 area, it takes live sales of fed cattle and averages that out in 5 states, I believe: Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado. What others am I missing? Between 5 states.
No, 5 area.
5 area, yeah. Anyway, but it settles to that, and yeah, as Bryce said, funds get in and speculate, and since those contracts do not take delivery for the most part, they can get in and get out and trade more than what is, I guess, needed for how many cattle there are in the country.
Yeah, so the speculators don't name the price of the market; they just create volatility,
Yeah.
which does create opportunity for hedgers, producers, or processors to be able to help secure some prices to protect. So the dynamics in dairy have changed quite a lot. We've been able to grow the herd over 200,000 head here, with slowing down on culling very significantly, and it's directly because of how high this beef price is. When we've got a day old calf bringing $1,000 plus, as high as what was the highest price around here? It got as high as I heard of one calf selling for $1,800 at home, but that was just one. What was the highest around here, like 1,500?
15's about,
Okay.
dairyman may answer that differently, but 850 on dairies, and then the crosses are 12 to 15 for having.
Gotcha. Yeah. So pretty incredible pricing. So that really changes your culling decisions when you can keep that animal, and if she's not really giving quite as much as she should. Well, as long as she's pregnant to Angus, I can dry her off either cheap and have her back in. And it's really funny talking to different dairymen when they're out there like, oh, these milk prices are so bad. We're going to cull a bunch of cows. Well, I'm like, well, you didn't breed her to Angus to have her in and cull her right away, did you? You go, no, I'm going to milk her out. Yeah, it's gonna take some time, So I think you'll see culling pick up eventually, but we've kind of got to sort those pregnant cows through the system, and then you still have a decision to ultimately make. Am I going to breed her to Angus again? Does that still pencil? I think a lot of times it will. Moving forward here. And especially, running through some calculations with herds we work with, by the time you add up your calf revenue and your cull cow revenue, you're looking at, well over $4 a hundredweight a lot of times. So it would take 3 on the low end, on top of your milk revenue. So as far as total receipts, even though the price of milk is not anything to really be excited about now, that beef revenue is all that important. Because if we lose that too, then we really don't have much to write home about. So that's really making a difference, as far as that goes. So I really believe the price of beef is going to be the key to being profitable or breaking even in the upcoming year here. And I think genomic testing has really kind of helped lead the way there. So as you can see, we've kind of been on an exponential rate of genomic testing females, and seeing which ones are worth keeping and breeding, and which ones aren't. And when everyone started breeding more beef on dairy, I would say back in 2018, kind of rings a bell in my head. We've been able to advance the genetics on more specifically Holsteins so much more quickly now, just because we're getting rid of and not culling right away, but we're culling the genetics passing on by those inferior females, and really improving production and components all along the way.
Do you have any data that the farms that are genetic testing their heifers, the ones that they decide that they don't want to raise, is there a certain percentage of those that is kept track of where they go? And are they they go to feedlots or they go to other areas that,
As far as
Yeah.
like heifers they call,
yeah, that say, hey, that didn't meet my specifications, I don't wanna raise her up the rest of the way, where does she go now?
I'd have to get back to you on that. I'm sure there's somewhere that we can find that. I would assume they get fed out. I know like 2 years ago, when I was still living in Wisconsin, a lot of times what was happening was the heifer raisers out there were having trouble, getting the value out of them, selling a bred heifer. So as the beef price started rallying quite a bit, they were like, "Well, I'm not going to breed this animal anymore. I'm just going to fatten her out that way, and I can get $3,000 for her when the dairyman only wants to pay me $2,200 when she's straightened up." So when that spread got so wide, they just fed them out. So I did see that in real time. No shocker, smallest cattle inventory of crude beef cows since 1951, and it's going to definitely take some time. Markets, yeah, telling us with this how disproportionate the spread is between fed and feeder cattle. That the market wants more calves. That's why we're getting over $1,000 for a day old calf, and I really think it's dairy is going to be a key contributor for beef in the future because we're consistent. Feedlots really appreciate that. How consistent and uniform those animals are in the feedlot. I think you'll hear Tara talk about that in the next presentation. Another thing that's really helped boost the feeder cattle price here is the lack of animals coming in from Mexico. About 1 million less head from a year ago. They did just do a major inspection last week at Santa Teresa, the largest import hub for feeder cattle at the Mexico border. There hasn't been a whole lot of news about that, but they keep finding screw worm closer and closer. So I know the USDA has been very vocal, or well, maybe not specifically USDA, but the administration has been very vocal about trying to bring down beef prices. I know they want to open the border and see some of those cattle coming back across, but it's going to take some time. The FDA just recently ended up approving a topical drug like compared to Epernex for killing the screw worm. So certainly helps. We'll see what the next headline is. And obviously, with the price of cattle, this has been having a large impact on the packer margins. I'm very sad that the big four aren't making money for once. About time it's our turn. But yeah, so I mean that's really had a large impact on what's been going on with feedlots. Owen will kind of talk about it in the next slide, but you'll see a lot of these feeder steers are getting fed out longer, and they're coming in at heavier weight because the markets, a lot of consumers are trading down to cheaper products. And what's the cheapest beef product we can get? Hamburger, right? Hamburger, it's cheap, it's good, it's easy, you can cook anything with it. The kids always love it, right? So everyone has been buying burger, and they can get cheap imports from like Brazil and Argentina and blend it with that extra fat, and we export steaks, and they want to try and that helps their margin a little bit, when they can slaughter more pounds of beef per animal on that, but it can only do so much. And I think you'll start to see, if we go through another year to 18 months of negative packer margins, you'll see more places close, like the big Tyson plant in Nebraska, and maybe you won't see closures, but they'll try to slow down the rate of kill, on that, just so they can keep those feedlot steers in the feedlot longer and try to back things up a little bit artificially, help bring the price down.
Yeah, going into the weights, the Packers have been, I mean, as you can see from this chart, they've been trying to get every pound of meat that they can off of every cow that they've brought in. When you're losing money, they've got to sell every bit they can. And that's kind of made up for the decrease in slaughter that we've seen this year. In prices, it hasn't quite, but it theoretically, it should, if you're getting an extra 50 pounds out of an animal, you know, they should be able to make up for some of those losses that they've been incurring all year. Going into some fundamentals, you've got your cutout prices, your box beef. This is what packers are actually selling their cuts for. Choice and select. Choice is higher quality, and select is more your ground beef. Also, I mean, those are the big things to look at: is the cutouts, the slaughter, how the packers behave, since they are such big players, as you all know. That is extremely important in these markets. And then also the dress weights. You see actual numbers there averaging 875 pounds, up quite a bit from the previous 2 years. Going into trade as well, as Bryce was saying, we import a lot of ground beef, and we export a lot of those, or we keep a lot of those, export a lot of ground beef, also import a lot of ground beef from places like Brazil and Argentina. The US loves ground beef. We love hamburgers. I do too. I mean, it's great. This year, as you can see, you know, those imports have been up quite a bit, and they've also been not as high as expected due to tariffs and due to the screw worm as well. This is beef imports, but feeder cattle also you can see how that would pencil into that. Exports have been down because of how high our prices are, and it's interesting to see where those are coming from in this political climate with these tariffs that we're seeing. Now going back to ground beef and 90% trim, that's that chart on the left there. That is directly correlated to cull cows. And that's why you've seen cull cow prices kind of skyrocket and stay high coming in, because there's such a demand for that 90% trim. Also, those tariffs on Brazil have kept us from importing a ton of that ground beef. So we've kept it here in the US. And yeah, cull cow prices have stayed fairly high and elevated, and we expect that to continue until we start importing a lot more ground beef, which is kind of inevitable going forward. Beef demand stayed very strong through all of this, even with these elevated prices. I mean, historic levels. You're paying $9 for a pound of ground beef at the store and $3 for chicken, and the consumer continues to pick the ground beef, you know. It's really incredible how we haven't seen that slow down at all. And that's really the question going into 2026 and further on: is will demand erode at all, or will it stay at record high levels?
You're gonna tell us, right?
Yeah, I've got the answer. Yeah. And this is kind of what I was talking about with that beef price. I mean, skyrocketing. It's incredible, and people continue to buy it, and rightfully so. I mean, you've got pork has kind of been phased out in that market share, and chicken has kind of stayed flat, and beef has really just been the one that's continued to take hold on the market. And that could be for a variety of reasons, you know. There's been such a big focus on protein in everyone's lives. Everyone's seen like the protein sodas, cookies, stuff like that. That's been a big part of the dairy markets as well, but I think it's came into our beef market in the same way. Herd rebuilding. This is an interesting part about the cattle market, is that we can kind of project where the herd is going to go from where we sit today. This graph illustrates it pretty well, along with prices. You know, you've got the inventories kind of bottoming out in early 2026 and heading higher into 2028, 29. All those, I mean, it's a cattle cycle for a reason, and we're able to predict it, which is nice. But I don't think anyone expected prices to remain this elevated, even with this low inventory. It's been really a perfect storm of many things.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, herd hands were in the bush, so a lot. There's been a little bit of evidence of rebuilding, but not a whole lot yet. We're looking at that ratio heifers to steers in the feedlots, and just haven't really seen that number increase quite yet. You know, once it starts to get up to 38% higher, heifers in the feedlot, or excuse me, as low as some down to towards 30, then that's when you can say, okay, people are retaining more heifers, but it's still closer to 40% there in the upper 30s. So it'll be interesting to see. If anyone's looking for a little summer project, if you got to watch the grass, I think personally, the market wants calves. As you can see there, the difference between a feeder animal and a bred heifer is pretty astonishing. So there's certainly a lot of cattle appreciation value there in a bred beef heifer. Heading into the fall, if she's pregnant.
Going into the global beef supply, there's two countries, Australia and Brazil. Argentina is not as big of a player, even though that was a big news story. I'm sure some of you saw. Those two countries are where we import a ton of our ground beef from, both of which have more. Well, Brazil has more cattle than us. Australia, similar, but the cycles of cattle are often inverted to the U.S., so we'll often make up that import number with our shortage. Tariffs have kind of prevented that. And looking at Brazil, they've had cow numbers decline and they're rebuilding as well right now. So that further plays into what we're seeing right now. Some watch factors in 2026. The big one is the Mexico border reopening. That will be for feeder cattle. And Secretary Rollins has been very adamant that the border will be opening. It's just a matter of time when, and those cattle start to trickle in. We don't know when. As Bryce said, there was that inspection last week that there's not a ton of information on what that is or what it looks like, but there's talks of opening the border back up. New World screwworm, that also comes hand in hand with that. Thankfully, we've not seen that in the U.S. yet. It's hard to say what the market reaction to something like that would be. Every time there's been rumors of it in the U.S., the market's been limited down, then it's been limited up. If there's rumors that it's close to the U.S., it's really an interesting situation and one that we don't really know how it's going to play out in the future. Hopefully it's contained, and those treatments that are coming out as well is a good sign. The headline risk, that is a big one. That's been about 2 months of the market's finally settling down, but you had President Trump say that we're going to import a ton of beef from Argentina, Australia. And I mean, you saw the market do a nosedive, and in what everyone was getting for their calves also.
Yeah, even in the cash market, it was crazy how, those headlines really swayed people on what they were willing to, buy for. Just nothing fundamentally changed because someone's, swinging with words around.
Yeah, exactly. You can't really talk more cattle in the market, and the market's kind of reacted to that. Cash has been strong recently and it's rebounded about half of that big move that it made. We talked about packing plant potential closures, managed money, and demand strength as well. So that's an overview of.
When do consumers run out of money? I don't know. The government's out of money, and we seem to keep going. So.
You have any questions before we sort of shift gears? Okay.
So in some of the sales values you have up there, you talk about consumers, but does that include retail as well? Like on the chicken versus beef, or retailers including that? Like restaurants is what I'm wondering if there's as much purchase power with beef still in restaurants at that price point as it has been in the past.
I think you've seen the volume of steaks, really, decrease, and the value of the exports is high, so we've still been able to get some demand traction there. But I think in the restaurants, you're seeing more of those steaks, get filtered through retail grocers, not as much on the restaurant side of things. All right, so Owen, what can we do about it? You gave us all this jargon, what's it all mean?
Yeah, so there are new ways to manage risk in the cattle market for dairy producers specifically. LRP, it now fits the beef on dairy life cycle. Starting July 1, the new crop year, you can get a government subsidized, basically a put option where you're setting a floor on your beef prices and getting paid if it drops below that level. It provides a minimum price for your day-old calves, essentially, is what this new product does. There's also a coal cow product that we'll talk about later. It's very similar to milk insurance, DRP. The main difference is that you can cover 100% of the board, 100% of that feeder cattle price with LRP, whereas the milk insurance is 95% of the board.
And you can also protect, if you're a beef producer or dairy producer raising those animals longer, it also allows you to do them in a different way, so you can do under 600 pounds, 600 to 1,000 pounds, or if you're feeding them all the way out, anything over 1,000 pounds as well.
So kind of touched on this, but these are the new changes for LRP in 2026, kind of focusing on that beef on dairy life cycle. You have the coal cows eligible and the unborn calves. This is your cross calves. Those can be covered now. Ownership must be maintained during the coverage period. You got to sell them as well, and you have time to pull from where you report those to the RMA.
So a dairy guy who's rating bottom 20 to beef straws and now enrolling in LRP.
Yes, yep.
Based on that weight, just.
Yeah, that's the new unborn calf program is starting July 1st. It's really quite new, but 99 pounds or less, down to 60, technically.
So why this matters, you can protect the value of your cross calves. That's an important thing. I mean, it's making up a ton of revenue in poor dairies and on farm. It's a major part of the whole industry now. And you can lock in that profitability. And it's ideal if you're looking to lock in a beef price for your farm.
Yeah, never thought I'd be standing here talking to you all in North Carolina about $1,200 calves, but yeah, here we are. So it's probably better to try to extend them if we can help it.
So here's a helpful chart about how LRP works. You've got that red line on the chart is where your strike would be if you're thinking about it as an option, or where your floor is. You've got your premium paid below that, and then anything below that red line, if your coverage settled there, it's much like milk insurance, you would receive a payout on that. So how this stacks up to futures and options and other things on the CME, forward contracts, OTC, stuff like that. The main difference is that LRP is subsidized. It's a 35% subsidy. There's no margin calls, which is always a good thing, not fun to deal with that. And you still have upside potential. You're just paying a premium. It's an insurance product, so you're paying a premium in case the price drops lower. I'll go over coal cows.
Yeah, so there is a program for coal cows now. It's not exactly ideal yet. Hopefully, the new crop year that starts July 1st next year, they allow you to go further out into time to help protect those prices. But for now, you can only go 3 months out into the future. So it kind of is what it is. As far as like my general take on the beef market, we kind of looked at it on that cattle cycle chart. I'm not too worried about the first 6 months of next year. I'm more worried about the last 6 months and into 27 and 8, when those prices could end up. So you can have your weight between 800 pounds and 1,500 pounds there, only going out 13 weeks or 3 months into the future. And then it's the same way with the calves or the coal cows. You can sell that animal either side of 30 days from that date you have chosen for an end date. So it gives you flexibility on actually sell those animals. And it is a 50% a multiple of feeder cattle, so that's how they're naming the actual price. So if the feeder cattle board price goes down, $1, you get 50 cents of that move for this program. And then that's your price adjustment factor, that 50%. And then there's also a seasonality adjustment based on a rolling 5-year average of historical pricing. I think that's on the next slide. Yep, yeah, so you get, a little bit more of an advantage there, into the spring months, for seasonality reasons, and then a little bit lower. Yeah, all of our beef producers calling those cows in the fall and kind of hitting the market and, not wanting to feed anything extra in the winter.
Calves, yeah. The unborn calves, it's the better product than the cull cows at this point, LRP wise. You can cover multiple endorsement lengths out to a full year out. Actually, we can go 10 months out right now. And yeah, it requires sales records in the event of an indemnity. It's also, you got 30 days to pull before and after that end of coverage date for selling your calves. We have people pull from before, so you're not getting overloaded there. So where is the source for the price data? Much like the cull cows, unborn calves takes what people are actually getting for these beef cross animals. It goes from the Pennsylvania and New York weekly summary, and they compile all that data, and then they look at the feeder cattle board, which we'll talk about on the next slide.
One of the reasons they chose New York and Pennsylvania when the RMA was in talks about making this insurance product at that time, those were the highest prices in the nation. I didn't know I can speak to it just because I live in New York, but there's 7 different calf buyers that are pretty large, in addition to all the Amish and Mennonite calf raisers. So there's quite a few buyers out there for calves.
This is where it gets kind of confusing with how you're actually paid on the product. It starts with the beef on dairy price from that Pennsylvania summary. And then you look at the feeder cattle index, which is what the feeder cattle contracts settle to. And it's basically looking at a correlation of what actual calves are getting versus what the feeder cattle board is doing. From there, you get a multiple. They're listed on the bottom of the screen there. But a general way to think about it is $1 move in the feeder cattle index is going to get you around $4 for each head that you insure.
You want to run through an example on the board?
Oh yeah, sure.
Oh, yeah, there's your whiteboard.
I've got a whiteboard.
I got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you guys read chicken scratch okay?
Yeah, it's gonna be ugly. All right, so I mean, let's say you lock in
300? I know it's low, but
300.
350.
Yeah.
350 sounds cool.
All right, 350. So you're locking in at $350 on the feeder cattle index on that day. Let's say this price adjustment factor is 4.2.
Yeah, let's do June 4.1.
4.1. All right. At a 4.1, you're
350 times 4.1 is 1435.
yeah. So that's saying that you're insuring a $1,435 calf.
But I think one of the things that gets mostly misconstrued with the actual way that it works, the 2 things that matter are the feeder cattle price that you're locking and that price adjustment factor. You don't want to look so much at the calf price there, because one of the most common questions we get is like, okay, if I send my calf to the sale barn or whoever, and they pay me $800, well, don't I get the difference between $1,435 and $800? And the answer is no, that is not the case. It's just how the CME feeder cattle index settles versus what you have locked in. So there's always, called basis risk, within that, and that's, where you can help manage that a little bit with who you're working on as far as buyers and stuff. From the folks I was talking to yesterday, it sounds like everyone does a pretty good job of keeping their calf buyers in check. Everyone's got a different one, and you compare if it's intelligent. So keep doing that.
All right. So this is what your endorsement would look like. You're locking in a 350 feeder cattle index at a 4.1 price adjustment factor. Let's say you're insuring 20 head in June, and you did this.
What's the cost of that premium? I want to say, $60.
Yeah, sure, $60.
Yeah, that's about the average yesterday. If you went like all the way through was $61.
$60 a head, 60
Okay.
times 20,
Yep.
1,200. 1,200.
Okay, and then let's say the feeder cattle board goes down to 300.
In June, it's at 300.
Yep.
Yep. So 6 months pass. Feeder cattle board's at 300. This price adjustment factor has stayed the same.
So 50 times 4.1 is going to be 205.
Yep. So this would be a $205 per head indemnity.
Well, 1230 is the final, and then yeah, 205 is the difference.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So then you take your final indemnity at $205 and subtract off the premium of $60. So then you'd be getting $145 per head of those 20 back in your pocket. So it'd be a total indemnity of $2,900, back to you. Plus you sold the calf.
Yes. That's just a hypothetical scenario.
Does that make sense?
How many policies can they have open at a time?
It's as far as like different type of cattle.
Well, or this, I mean, like it says buy a 17-week policy and the next one buy a 13-week policy. Like I get the LRP on the feeder calf thing, because we sell them all at one time. So
Yeah.
a dairy that's having so many a month, and you say, okay, you booked on the June price. I'm expecting 20 dairy feed process for June. What about my other 11 months?
Yeah, you can, as long as that date is available to purchase insurance on, then you, yeah, you can do it. It'd be 10 months.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
the breeding decision you're making today, you could theoretically cover for,
Once she's confirmed bred.
Yeah.
yeah, you could, I have folks do it, even at that 9 or 10 month mark, they're just, doing a conservative amount, if they know they're gonna breed, 200, that month, they'll cover, I don't know, 50.
And it's by head, not by weight.
By head, yep, correct, yes, correct, and then, the head just have to meet the minimum weight requirement, so in that case, it'd be 60 pounds. For the day olds, yeah.
Here's an example of what quotes would look like. We kind of went through this here on the things that you're actually looking at, but that expected value is that price adjustment factor times the feeder cattle index. Everything here is listed a little bit strange, but the big things to look at are the total premium per head and also the dates on there for sure. Yeah, and the coverage can give you, or the coverage level that expected value number can give you an idea of if you're looking at a high factor or a low factor for a specific month.
So this is like the dashboard that
That's
you
like
would
what you would
see.
see.
You would,
yeah,
your client would see that.
Yeah, we're going to make your decision, and then on the backside, we keep track of the feeder cattle, price you locked in, and that price adjustment factor, that's what. So then you can pull up on your phone easily, like, hey, where am I locked in at, if I look at the CME, see, what's going on.
I'll go with that.
And then, just a feeder steer example, so if you're keeping those animals further out, at a later date to sell, or if you're a beef producer, so same idea, you're locking in that CME feeder cattle price minus the premium, with that subsidy. You do have to be, I should add, to get the subsidy, you have to be conservation compliant. Some people don't like doing that. You can still participate. You just pay more for it because of that. But as long as you're conservation compliant, you're good. And then, same idea with that. You pay the premium, set your floor price, and that's that. And then you're protected further out there. And then same thing with the fatter fat steer heifer example. that settles to that 5 area, steer, average, and, that's that, so you can go out as far as a year into the future. And we try to, I think one of the, main things to, help consider, as a risk management advisor, whatever you're doing in that physical cash market with that animal, I need to know what that is, so then I am able to give a proper recommendation to, know which tool is, right for you to use. I had one producer, set a fixed price contract with it, and then I was, recommending, hey, this is a good time to place coverage, and then they're like, oh, I got my calves locked in for a year at $1,100. I was like, you never told me that. They're like, oh, I didn't. I was like, yeah, that's important. That's important. I need to know that information, because then, there's no, one size fits all for, any of this stuff. If that's a better decision, for your business, if it's more predictable, and you've also locked in your local price, there's a few different ways to do it. We'll go over that too. So what other tools are there? We can talk about, physical purchases or sales, in this case, contracts, forward contracts, same thing with the physical, sales. There's the CME futures market and, options contracts, along with that. And then, another one called, over the counter, desk, trading protection. So that should say sell. That's a typo on my part, but in this case, if, you were looking to, have a contract, with a calf buyer or, whoever you're selling those, animals to, if you set a fixed price or, a set basis level, or just a number of calves, if you're committing to that buyer, a lot of times on these contracts, sometimes they'll get pretty, picky about like a grade 1 or 2. In the weight and all that stuff. If you can kind of have that, stuff, lined out, really, really well, so that way there's no, misconceptions, within that contract. That's something I see a lot of people get, dinged on. It's, they want the cash, pay up for it, man. So I kind of help, advise people on that. For forward contracts, that's basically the same thing there. And then, with futures, some people, don't like, the insurance. So there's other tools to be able to do that. Futures contracts, would involve, having a CME brokerage account and, selling, futures contracts and, having, margin. It's basically a security deposit to be able to, trade that contract. On the CME, takes a more upfront capital that, I wouldn't be willing to put up, but some people are. Everyone's different, so it's certainly an option, out there. I would be, more, gearing people towards options contracts on the next slide there. So, LRP is nothing more than a subsidized, put option. There's two different types of options. There's puts and there's calls. I like to think of it like a phone call. If I want to protect prices from going up, I'm gonna pick up the phone and call up. So protect prices from calling up. And then after I'm done with my phone call, I put my phone down. So if I want to protect from prices going down, put down, call up, put down, call up. It's just the way my system thinks about it. But so in this case, you're protecting from prices falling. You would, want to buy a put option, and that put option, you pay a premium just like insurance, and that, protects you from the market falling. It's not subsidized in this case, but, unlike insurance, you could, follow the market. Like if you bought a put option today and the market falls, I don't know, $30 in the next 2 weeks or something, you said, hey, Bryce, I want to take my money, on that position and offset it. You can't do that. You can get in and out as many times as you want, versus the insurance. You're stuck with that position now, but it's kind of the nuances there. And then, over the counter or swap trading, back on a previous slide, we were kind of comparing the price of fresh 90 trim and, cold cow pricing. A lot of times, you'll see that direct relationship with your cold cow pricing. So, we're actually working with Cargill is one of the providers we have for over the counter trading. And we're working with them. They have a lot of fast food restaurants on their end that have been, not knowing what they've been paying for the price of burger for the past 3 years or so. So they just really want to know what they're paying. So this isn't an actual physical contract. It's just a piece of paper based on the price of a commodity. In this case, it's actually hamburger. There's no CME contract for hamburger, right? So this gives us a place to, help, have a more tailored approach to, a person's commodity. So we'd be buying a price floor on the price of hamburger 12 months out into the future for cold cows in that case. So we've been doing some of that.
Yeah, to conclude, there's no one size fits all approach to everything. Every business is different. Bryce went into that. Everybody's got different risks, doing different things, different strategies. And the right risk management plan accounts for that. There's no, everyone should do this. Consistency is key. It's easy to get emotional in buying insurance or trading. And it's important to just keep going and keep, because you're going to make it up and lose it. And that's that's the basic principle of hedging,
Yeah, and I think one of the things about hedging it, it'll help give you cash for your business in times that you really do need it. Like now, we're looking at it. If I'm a producer that doesn't have any milk protection on, so I'm getting the the true milk price. And now the beef market goes to, that's where, the risk really lies, in the market now. And you want to be, consistent with knowing your cost and then knowing where the risk is for your business. So, I would be looking at, protecting the beef prices, at that point. And then just understanding the tools and having the right expectations, with how they work for sure. And there's our contact information. I work with 100 clients coast to coast, working in all the different areas there of dairy, cattle, and feed markets. Some guys I just work with on feed, some just cattle, some dairy, some everything. Every operation is different, and just trying to have heartful conversations to figure out what's best for everyone, and come up with a plan and keep track of that, and have a good line of communication and keep farming. I mean, if I could be home milking 100 cows with a stall, I would, man. So
Yeah, and any market questions too. This goes for any general questions. We're more than willing to answer anything that y'all have.
yeah, there's no a lot of our competitors will have a set, fee for advisory and this and that. There's no set program for that. If you have a policy or brokerage account open with us, that doesn't cost any money, and that's part of our service. If you have an account, we're ready to work for you. Thanks for your time.
Yeah.
Any questions?
What's the smallest producer that you work with?
100 cows. Yeah, and then I like trying to help different people. So I have a few clients. I'm more familiar with grants and the Northeast, just where I'm from. But I'll help producers apply for grants on the side a little bit and stuff, and just keeping people up to date with what's going on in FSA, EMC signups and stuff like that. But try to help where I can.
I got a few farms in North Carolina they've been visiting with that are their clients, so y'all are welcome to add some more. All right, if you don't have any other questions, we do. Maybe we saw a hand.
But he's on.
Yeah.
You mentioned that imports increasing is inevitable. Any thoughts on timeline for that?
I was talking to my coworker about this the other day because I was having the same thought, of course, and we figured by the time the tariffs came off, and with how harvesting works down in Brazil, and by the time it gets onto the ship and gets up here, we did expect those fresh at 90 trim prices to hit the market at some point, mid Q1, February, maybe early part of March. And a lot of those orders, the way it works for beef exports, they'll have a quota for how much a country is allowed to import. And last year, those orders were done those orders were filled contractually within the first 2 weeks in January. So just to give you an idea.
Okay.
Thanks for your time. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thank you guys.
All right, so I'm gonna transition to Tara Felix, who's joining us from Penn State. She can be on Zoom, so if you need a quick bathroom break, now's the time, but we're gonna keep churning. So if you're familiar with the place, you know it. If not, out here to the left. I'm gonna get techie, get her connected, so y'all can laugh at me while I'm turned around. Okay. All right, Tara. I'm gonna move this back to that. Okay. I'm gonna work on downloading another presentation while you're getting ready. They're taking a quick break, but we will get right on here.
Brittany, whenever you get a chance, if you can just confirm you see my opening slide.
You're good, Tara? All right, not many people left, so I'm gonna go ahead and get us started.
Right.
All right, so we're gonna keep rolling. Next speaker is Tara Felix from Penn State. And she's got her voice is gonna be coming out of here, so let me know if in the back of the room you can't hear, and I'll try to figure it out. But we're gonna turn it over and let Tara get started and introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Brittany. I appreciate that. My name is Tara Felix. I'm the Beef Cattle Extension Specialist with Penn State University, and I want to thank y'all for allowing me to come virtually to you today. Trying to find flights, first of all, from Pennsylvania to Charlotte this time of year can be a bit dicey, and I gave my final late last night, so I appreciate the grace and space to join in a little bit of an unconventional manner. I am the extension specialist, as I said, for Penn State and for beef cattle. And so it might seem a little bit odd, perhaps, that I'm coming to you with a title of a talk, The Supply Chain Realities from Dairy to Beef. But in the 10 years now that I've been with Penn State Extension, I've been working predominantly on ways to use dairy progeny in beef production systems. And so that's kind of my background and a little bit of my history. I always like to start my extension presentations with a little bit of a question. So Brittany, maybe you can be my eyes and ears in the room. I was trying to do a head count while y'all were bobbing up and down on break. And it looked to be just close to 20 of you in the room. And I'm curious, how many of you are dairy producers? Raise a hands.
Yeah, you're gonna have 3 or 4 or 5, 3, 4, 5 of them.
Okay. How many of you are beef producers?
Another 5, not necessarily overlapped, but some are.
So half y'all didn't raise your hands.
Most of them did.
Shame on you. You would be the people in class I'd start throwing candy at. So all you that are dairy producers should have raised your hand for beef producers as well. If you produce dairy, you produce beef, because ultimately at the end of her 2.7 lactations, she's gonna become that ground beef previous speakers we're talking about that the Americans love so much, right? So if you produce dairy, you produce beef. In addition to that, when we think about supply chain realities, the proportion of, and this is just fed cattle, the proportion of fed cattle that supply the beef supply chain in the United States is about 20%. Now that looks a little bit different compared to some of our European counterparts because we have extensive grazing opportunities in the United States and we rely heavily on what we call our native beef population, our beef breeds, Angus, Simmental, etc. Other countries have predominantly dairy industries and thus rely a lot more on their dairy industries to supply a portion of their beef. I bring this up merely to say that our situation that we find ourselves in the United States right now is not unique, and it's not even really that unique for the United States. This has been our reality for quite some time. It just looks a little bit different, i.e. comes in a little bit of a different color right now. So when we think about this supply chain, it has a number of different branches off of it, and I think that's perhaps that's what I am going to focus on today because that's where some of the challenges come in when we think about using these dairy progeny in our beef production systems. So first and foremost, we start at the dairy farm with our beef on dairy supply chain. The question there is, does that dairy farm supply colostrum to the calf? What genetics are going to be used for that calf? It was brought up during the last presentation that, we're just make a black calf, right? That's what we're doing to get these calves where they need to be. But on the dairy side, we're very heavily focused on genomics, right? And so I would challenge us that as an industry, we have to become a bit more integrated with one another and be focused on the ramifications at that early life stage throughout the supply chain. After that calf leaves the dairy farm, it will go through a sale barn more than likely or to one of the buyers the gentleman previously talked about. Either way, it's going to be transported in some instances quite some distance. We have calves in Pennsylvania that leave and go to Texas or Michigan or wherever else. So usually there's quite a bit of distance those animals travel in their lifetime. After that, transport through and potentially running through the sale barn, they'll go to a wet calf ranch, and that wet calf ranch is going to be responsible for getting that calf started on the right track in life. And we're going to talk a little bit more about ramifications of how that calf is raised at the wet calf ranch that are ultimately going to impact the beef potential of that animal. Finally, usually there's a step in between there where they might go to what we've called a grower ranch, where maybe they're fed a slightly less energy dense diet. They're grown out for a period of time before they would enter a feedlot system, which would be our conventional feedlots, grain-based diets, where we would prepare those animals to fatten for slaughter. Once they get to slaughter, there are now some contracts available for these beef on dairy crossbreds based on whether or not we can state their genetic potential that was achieved at the dairy farm. So if I could figure out how to make slaughter go all the way back to dairy and do a closed loop, I would do that. I tried to use one of those like ChatGPT to come up with a really cool graphic for this instead of just a bar chart. But I realized I'm probably too old to use ChatGPT, and so I gave up on that pretty quick. Now, why did all this start? Let's back up just a little bit to that dairy farm. As was presented in the previous presentation, that advantage of using sex semen technology really pushed and accelerated genetic advancement at the dairy farm. So sex semen technology came on the screen, was in the research screen somewhere in the late 90s, but really didn't start to be used heavily in dairy farms until about 2006. And then the graph was showed in the previous presentation about the use of PTAs for genomic selection of those dairy heifers. It really didn't start until 2009. Keep in mind that we did not sequence the bovine genome until 2008. I distinctly remember because it was my first year in grad school, my PhD, and the Science magazine article came out, said, hey, we have sequenced the bovine genome. We're on our path, right? It was a big deal. We tend to think of everything that we've done on the dairy side as this very novel, very or very historical growth potential. But the reality is, in the history of science, less than 20 years is a pretty doggone short time to make an achievement. If you think about things like how long we've been studying astrology and those kinds of things, and it really blows my mind the advancements that the dairy industry has made in less than 20 years. So kudos to y'all that raised your hands as folks in the dairy industry in the room. What this means is that for beef on dairy supply chain, we really haven't been talking about this for more than, we haven't even been talking about it for 10 years yet. And the only reason in the United States that we're currently talking about this beef on dairy phenomenon is because in 2017, we completely devalued, we being the industry as a whole, completely devalued the Holstein bull calf and we said, all right, well, the dairy, you all said, all right, if we're not going to get anything for these bull calves that we're going to take to market, we're going to turn them into something else. So by 2018, dairies began heavily investing in beef cattle semen straws, and these are the domestic semen sales only in the United States. If we put both domestic and custom collection on here, the number of straws would be a lot greater. The point of this graph is this: at the same time that we started using beef semen heavily in the dairy, there was a concomitant decrease in the use of dairy semen straws. So that would be the red line. So the green line goes up as the red line comes down. So pretty clearly, we didn't turn around overnight and become start using AI far more in the beef industry. This is very clearly associated with our use of those technologies in the dairy industry. And when we started in 2018, it was pretty simple. All we need is a black hide. We need something to change the color of that animal so that when we take it to the auction barn, it isn't a Holstein, it's a black-hided animal. And then maybe we would like to know that that dairy cow isn't going to get screwed up if I put that black-hided animal in it, and I can still milk her after the fact, even if she is in her 4th lactation and I should be drying her off, right? So that was it. For early selection, basically, we cleaned out the tanks, right? Cleaned out the semen tanks. We had reports in Pennsylvania of fellas putting semen straws in from Angus bulls that hadn't been used since the 1980s, right? Just to get that black-hided color and try not to mess up subsequent milk production. Because of that, because of the emphasis on the color and the polled nature of those animals, some of the earliest genetics, or a lot of the earliest genetics, were heavily influenced by Angus. So there were 3 different surveys conducted during these the early evolution of beef on dairy, and all of them to a T cited heavily the use of Angus. Not surprisingly then, the Angus Association came up with the first terminal index for crossbreeding to dairy cows. So the Angus Holstein Index and the Angus Jersey Index were published sometime around 2019. I think it was August 2019. The Holstein Index heavily focused on those terminal characteristics for growth and muscle development that we value in beef production, and devalued height. So if a sire was tall, he got kind of a demerit on the Angus on Holstein index, whereas the Jersey index didn't focus as much on that. The challenge is that during this time, there was still a number of dairy producers, particularly smaller producers, that were pulling whatever out of the tank or going to the auction barn and picking up a bull, right? So I went to visit with a 250 cow dairy here in Pennsylvania, and they were kind of aging out of the dairy business, talk about wanting to milk 100 cows in a tie stall and be perfectly happy. That was never exactly my dream, partly because I've got a bad back, so there's an aging out process that occurs in dairy. So these fellas wanted to switch, and they said, we've decided we're going to become beef cattle producers. We're going to breed ourselves out of the dairy business. And I said, great. How are you going to do that? He said, well, we picked up an Angus bull at the marketplace. Took me back. Here's our Angus bull. Thank you. Even this works even virtually then.
Yes.
So a couple of you laughed. Why? What's unique about this Angus bull?
Nice horns.
He has horns, right? The Angus breed is what we call a genetically polled breed. There are no Angus cattle with horns. And so this was early in the evolution. We're just starting to talk about terminal indexes and those kinds of things. And we have to keep in mind always, and y'all are sitting in the same room today, but generally, beef producers and dairy producers speak very different languages, right? When dairy producers select bulls for their mating decisions, they focus on PTAs. When beef producers select bulls for their mating decisions, they focus on EPDs. We don't speak the same language, and we sure as heck don't do a good job educating each other. And so this was a challenge early in our beef on dairy production systems. Well, once we got those terminal indices published, we continued to increase the domestic sales of beef semen straws to the point that last year, 2024, over 9.7 million units of beef semen were sold in the United States. Again, the beef industry is predominantly natural service. It's just how we function. And most of these are going into the dairy industry. Now, what's interesting about this is I said they just look a little bit different, right? So these are the data from the National Beef Quality Audit. What the National Beef Quality Audit does is it goes into packing houses around the United States, and it publishes a call cow and a call bull report, and then it publishes their fed report. So this happens to be data from their fed report. I've comprised several of their summaries over the years, starting in 2000 all the way until the last one that was published in 2022. What this report shows you is that in 2016, 20.4% of the cattle killed in fed cattle production systems in the United States were Holstein, black and white hide. Okay? In 2022, that number dropped to 12.3%. Now, that doesn't mean we're killing less progeny through fed cattle systems in our fed packing plants. What that means is we just changed the color of those. And unfortunately, because the NBQA audit isn't based on genetics, it's based solely on hide color, we don't have any way now of capturing those beef on dairy that are coming through our packing plants, which is a challenge that the USDA is trying to overcome right now. So one of the first questions we have to ask is when we do these different matings, when we switch from a Holstein bull to a beef bull, does this impact our cow production? You know, yes, a lot of fellas have switched now. A lot of dairies have switched to where they're producing those beef on dairy matings out of their lesser genetics, and as they should be. But as was mentioned earlier, there's still the potential to milk that cow. So does carrying a beef sired calf mess up that dairy cow? Well, I'm going to scroll through this for the sake of time fairly quickly, but long story short, there is no influence or no negative impact of carrying a beef sired calf. So when we look at things like gestation length and the probability of being born stillborn, while there is an impact of sire breed, if we look at these data, what we can pull out pretty quickly is those cows that are bred to Wagyu sires. So if anybody's into breeding really fancy genetics to your dairy cows, those calves sired by Wagyu sires tend to be held in the womb 8 days longer than a typical Holstein calf. 8 days is a heck of a long time, folks. If you think about your dry off period and your transition period, when you add an extra 8 days onto that, you're talking about real money there in terms of milk production to go 8 days longer dry. Now, if you look at the rest of those beef sires, they all have a slight increase, and that averages out to be about 2 days. So if we calve out a beef sire, there's potential for that cow to hold that calf 2 days longer. If we remove the Wagyu sire genetics from the data set and say, okay, they're held a really long time, let's just pull them out. There's not a huge differential then in the probability that a calf will be born stillbred. Keep in mind these crossbred beef genetics here at the time that these data were collected would have included anything that wasn't a registered purebred animal. And so there are some challenges associated, and thus the error bar is large associated with those crossbred beef genetics. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Back to the point where we don't speak the same language then. Initially, we were selecting bulls for calving ease. So we were selecting beef sires with calving ease potential to go into the dairy system. But when we talk about calving ease in the beef production system, we talk about putting those cows out on the back 40 and coming out 9 months later and finding all your calves born alive, right? That's calving ease for beef production. When we talk about calving ease on a dairy production scale, we're talking about the fact that we didn't necessarily have to cut her open, and so that was good calving ease, right? And so the dairy industry defines calving ease on a scale of 1 to 5 as anything less than 4, or anything greater than 4, excuse me, being the definition of dystocia. But the beef industry uses a 3. So in selecting all these beef sires for calving ease initially, we were selecting for much more calving ease than we even expect out of our Holstein sires. And that's what this slide is trying to tell you here. Either way, across all of those genetics, there was no difference in calving ease score when that dam carried a Holstein calf or a beef sired calf. There also were not any health effects on the postpartum cow period, and there were no differences in her milk production or milk components after she sired a beef calf. So all this comes around to say, if we have a beef cow or a beef sire mated to a dairy cow, we will not screw up our subsequent lactation of that dairy cow. So this is good news. Again, these were data from our lab here at Penn State, but others, including Foraker and Warner at Texas Tech and Barry's group out of Ireland, have showed the same results in their beef on dairy cross matings and results from their cow production trials. Now, we always wanted to know still, what's the breed, right? What's the impact of sire breed on the beef production potential of those calves? We know the dam's gonna be fine regardless of the breed that we use now. What about the impact on these terminal characteristics that are really gonna drive beef production, ultimately food security? The reality is that we could select any number of breeds. So Bailey Basile was a PhD student of mine. We bred Charolais, we bred Wagyu, we bred Simmental, we bred Angus, and we kept those calves all the way from semen insemination until slaughter. There was no difference in ribeye area, tenderness, carcass weight, average daily gain, except, again, for the Wagyu calves. The Wagyu calves grow slower, don't yield as much, and just take longer days on feed than those calves that are sired from our other beef sires. So this was interesting, but ultimately by the time we published this paper in 2024, what had happened is the industry said, hey, as per usual, university, we're a couple steps ahead of you, right? The industry, when we first started breeding beef to dairy cows, we didn't even have enough semen straws to supply all the demand from the dairy industry for those straws, which is why we see all these little blips in here of different breeds as we're trying to figure this out. So the industry was kind of sorting through which straws to use and when to use them. And ultimately what they landed on in 2023 and 2024, the National Animal Breeders Association, the National Association of Animal Breeders, published for the first time this new term, which they called heterospermic beef semen. These are straws from your ABS, your Select Sires Profit Source, your ST Genetics TD Beef kind of sires. So these are largely composite sires. They largely represent straws with 2+ sires per straw, because we also know that sometimes the uterine environment dictates which bull the cow will get bred to. And so the premise here is, or the hypothesis here is, that if we put a couple more sires in that straw, the likelihood that we'll get that dam pregnant on first conception increases. Now, when I say these are largely composite genetics, what the genetics industry and the semen companies did was essentially develop lines of bulls with characteristics deemed desirable by the dairy industry. We're not going to mess up milk production, calving ease isn't going to be affected, and oh, by the way, these calves will have the potential to gain weight quickly and finish out well, yielding high beef returns. What's interesting to me is we've maintained our focus on that black hide, partly because our certified Angus beef production in the United States is skyrocketing right now. More calves than ever before are qualifying for certified Angus beef. But we held a big Beef on Dairy symposium in Chicago in October. Chip Kemp is with 701X Consulting and does a lot of consulting with beef on dairy crosses in feed yards across the United States. And he said, if you can put Shars in these cows, Shars cross on Holsteins win in the feed yard all day long. And that was sort of a little thank you, Chip, for that acknowledgement, because when we first started out, I said, I want to breed Charolais to Holstein because all the historical data said Charolais would win, right? So here are some pictures of some Charolais in my feedlot here at Penn State. And they are beautiful animals. They yield phenomenally well. They gained at 4 pounds a day. I mean, just absolutely tanks in a feedlot. But as you can see from this picture, they come in quite a variety of colors, right? And so when we're talking about those premiums that could be applied on the carcass end, the CAB premium, which is the heftiest premium right now on the carcass side, only applies to those animals with a black hide. And it doesn't matter whether that black hide is Angus or whether it comes from any other dilution factor, or genetic factor that will influence that black hide. But it has to be a black hide. So Charolais will not qualify for CAB, which is partly why I think they haven't had more success when it comes to breeding programs. If you're not targeting a genetics program or a specialty market, though, they gain really well. Now, I mentioned these different phases. So we've kind of highlighted the dairy phase. We've talked a little bit about those genetics that we're putting in order to make sure we can get those calves to yield optimal meat production. Where we have fallen perhaps a little bit short is that we've kind of put the cart before the horse, right? We've said, okay, we're beef on dairy's here to stay. We're doing all these mating decisions. Dairies are breeding 30 to 50% of their cows now to beef sires and producing these beef on dairy calves. But I would argue, and I'm not necessarily alone in this, that we still don't really know or understand the optimal way to manage those beef on dairy calves. So let's start with that pre-weaning period. When that calf goes to the wet calf ranch, we still have a lot of questions. How much milk should we feed that calf? How long should we feed that calf milk? There's a lot of Purina publications that would support feeding milk for up to 12 weeks. But anybody that's raised dairy heifers and tried to make a profit at it would know that if you feed milk for 12 weeks, it becomes really difficult to eke a buck out of that weaned calf. Most of the industry is doing 4 to 6 weeks of milk feeding for these calves. I would argue at 4 weeks, you don't even have a rumen developed to feed solid feeds yet. But the question on what's the optimum length of time remains. The other question is, what do we do about the type of milk replacer that we feed? I did a study with the University of Connecticut. Dr. Sarah Reed, Dr. Kristen Gabani are some really great muscle biologists up there. And I said, at the end of the day, we want beef on dairy calves that produce beef. Beef is muscle, beef is protein. And yet we feed them like we're feeding a developing heifer. We feed them like we're trying to grow a mammary gland on an animal we don't want to grow a mammary gland on. So I said, what if we fed them like beef cattle are fed? And that's what we did. We fed a milk replacer that had similar protein and fat content to beef cow milk replacer. So it was a 30-32. And then we fed a conventional milk replacer that was 20-22. And what we found was those animals that we fed higher fat, higher protein in the milk replacer to grew faster and had larger cross-sectional muscle fiber area. To me, this says we still don't know exactly the optimum way to feed these calves, but it may not be with conventional milk replacer, right? There's a lot of people doing research. Iowa State's researching this area right now. My lab's continuing some of this research right now at Penn State, and hopefully we'll have some answers on that before too soon here. The industry is kind of moving back towards nipples, which I think is interesting. You know, what goes around comes around. You think, oh, buckets are easier to clean, buckets are easier to feed, but the calves will drink better out of a nipple and get less respiratory disease out of a nipple. And so we see a big shift, particularly from the ethologists, which are the folks really concerned with animal well-being, back to nipple feeding and milk systems. But again, we don't speak the same language, right? Our definition of a good cow in the beef industry is, can she wean a live calf for us every year? And hopefully that calf weans somewhere between 500 and 700 pounds, right? When we're talking about these beef on dairy crosses, now we're weaning them in 4 to 6 weeks of age. Hopefully they're reaching 200 pounds. Hopefully they've doubled their birth weight by that point in time. But not always. And so again, our production scenarios are very different. During that time of that pre-weaning phase, we're starting that calf on grain to try and push rumen development a little bit earlier than what we would see in a typical beef calf. The question is, what's the best feed we should be feeding to that calf? I think the industry would agree it's probably something textured, and we probably need to start supplying it early, and maybe it needs more protein than what we fed to purebred Holsteins that we were raising for lactation. But we don't know all those things for certain yet, because the reality is there's only been about 3 publications so far that have taken these calves all the way from birth to weaning. One of them was Bailey's paper on genetics, and so we fed everything the same because we were trying to monitor genetics. One of them is a calf paper from my lab that I'll show you later that was on health, so we fed everything the same. And only one of them so far has investigated nutrition, and that was largely post-weaning strategies. So we still have a lot of questions here around this particular age point. There is perhaps one point of agreement, regardless of which side of the fence you're on, and that is that all these calves must get colostrum. The calf's immune system is based on, largely, initially anyway, based on the successful transfer of immunity from maternal antibodies that come through colostrum. That calf will not develop a fully mature immune system of its own until it's about 8 months of age. If you think again back to our traditional beef production systems where we're weaning somewhere around 6 or 7 months of age, we're a lot closer to that mature immune system than we are in a beef on dairy calf that we wean at 56 days of age, right? At 56 days of age, which is right out here, you can see those calves' antibodies are just starting to tick up. But they really aren't getting started until almost 2 weeks of age. So that first 2 weeks of that calf's life, if it does not have maternal antibodies from colostrum, its risk of mortality and morbidity, so getting sick and dying, is much, much greater than a calf that gets adequate colostrum. Now, if you go back to my challenges in the supply chain, usually we don't know this, right? If we're picking these calves up from a sale barn or a calf buyer and they're being transported to us with a couple days of age, we don't necessarily know, unless we have a personal relationship with that dairy, whether or not those calves got colostrum. But colostrum is absolutely essential to the success of these calves. So I have a PhD student right now by the name of Ingrid Fernandez, and she was interested in what happens if these calves get sick. We ensured that all of her calves got colostrum, so we did a serum total protein test, which is a quick blood test that we can use to make sure that everybody had adequate colostrum and good passive transfer, or successful passive transfer, I should say. But then she monitored those calves from birth all the way to slaughter. And at weaning, which is when calves typically get respiratory disease, we did a lung ultrasound on all those calves because Ingrid's research from, or previous research from the USDA would suggest that 32% of, almost 33% of dairy calves get bovine respiratory disease, and that number is much lower in our beef production systems. But of those calves that get respiratory disease out of a dairy production system, up to 6% of them can die, more if they're commingled calves, less if they're single source calves. So this is a big issue for the industry. In fact, Daryl Peel wrote an entire paper in 2020 on the cost of bovine respiratory disease to the cattle industry, not just beef or dairy, but to the cattle industry in general, and cited as several $100 million. Those calves in previous research in dairy heifers, so pre-weaned dairy heifers that have gotten respiratory disease as denoted by lung ultrasound, have reduced average daily gain to the tune of about 1/4 pound a day. So what we don't know is the impacts on that calf post-weaning or long-term. So Ingrid investigated these impacts and found, just like we have seen other studies, her calves also suffered a reduction in average daily gain, and it was pretty doggone close to what other studies had seen in their research. But then she followed these calves through the rest of their life. She followed them all the way through the feedlot period, where average daily gain was identical, all the way out to slaughter. There was no difference in the days on feed, average daily gain, or dry matter intake of these calves, whether or not they had BRD shortly post-weaning. But what did differ is those calves that never got sick, those were our control calves, those calves had a higher marbling score than the calves that were diagnosed with BRD at weaning. Now, why did this happen? Well, ultimately, when we think about intramuscular adipogenesis, which is the fat cells that get deposited into a steak that make it taste nice, right? Those cells are begin to be determined at birth. So genetics play a large part in those cells. But at birth, there is still this window of opportunity where we can alter what we call adipocyte hyperplasia, which is the number of fat cells, okay? So up to 250 days of age, we can still alter the number of fat cells in an animal, we think. Post 250 days, all we do is fill those fat cells. So Ingrid's calves were diagnosed with bovine respiratory disease at weaning, which was 61 days of age. That diagnosis, when those calves were finally killed at 473 days of age, so 412 days later, impacted their ability to adequately deposit marbling. This is a big issue because our cattle are bought and sold out of our fed cattle systems largely on a grid basis. And that grid is based on how well they yield, so how much muscle they have, and how well they fatten, how much intramuscular fat they have. And so this has real economic implications in how we raise these beef on dairy calves. And as I told you, we still don't have a very clear picture on how to optimize this number of fat cells yet, but we know if they get sick, it has a big impact. Now, one of the things that's been discussed among the beef on dairy community was, okay, if a little bit of colostrum is good, perhaps more is better. And not just in the beef on dairy community, but across the dairy sector as well when we're talking about rearing wet calves. So a former PhD student of mine, Dr. Pedro Carvalho, did this work in California at some very large calf ranches where he investigated the impact of feeding extended colostrum. So the green line would be animals got colostrum for an extended period of time during their wet calf phase, whereas the orange line would be calves got an initial dose of colostrum, but then got no additional colostrum after that initial dose. What's interesting about these data, and I shouldn't chuckle, but Pedro calls this a delayed death curve. So this is a mortality curve, or it's a survival curve, if you will, on the y-axis. And so this is the likelihood of calves dying is what this line predicts, right? And so those calves that got extended colostrum on the green line, yeah, they stayed in the trial a little bit while longer, but then they still eventually died. And so Pedro said, I'm not sure about this extended colostrum thing. Maybe all we're doing is delaying death, and we invest a lot more into these animals and then still end up with a dead animal at the end of the day. So this is work that's going to be ongoing, and it needs to be further investigated, because there are real animal well-being concerns for extending out the period of time before that animal ultimately leaves the system, as well as economic concerns. I maybe tend to focus a little bit more on the economics of it, because I think if we've got 50 days invested in that animal, it's ready to wean, and we're weaning it and then it's dying. That's a real problem. Now, after weaning, then, after we move these calves either to a grower ranch or into a feedlot, we have some real challenges as well. This is one of the first pictures that I took at a large dairy here in Pennsylvania that was what I would call an innovator in their use of beef semen straws. So these are Wagyu cross calves. And I said, can I see your beef on dairy calves? And this dairy producer took me down, and these are his Wagyu calves. Where do you think they're being grown out? Well, if you look in the background here, what are all these? It's this developing heifer pen, right? So again, talking about this whole supply chain and how far we've come. Initially, these calves were getting thrown post-weaning. They were being reared up with the dairy heifers and get thrown in the dry cow pen. As a feedlot nutritionist, I struggle with this, right? My training is all in the feedlot, all feedlot nutrition for my PhD, where I want calves to gain 4 pounds a day, crank through, because, oh, by the way, my return is dictated by how efficiently they use feed and how quickly I can get them out of that building so I can put new calves that are going to gain efficiently back in. What's my goal in my dairy heifer bends? How much do I want them to gain?
Fill my freezer.
You want your dairy heifers to fill your freezer? Sometimes they will if they split, right? But generally, the goal on dairy heifers is to gain about 900 grams. I always have to do the conversion because I talk to too many scientists. So what's that? 2 pounds a day. A little less than 2 pounds a day. That's our goal for our dairy heifers. Why? Because if she gains more than that, she's going to put too much fat in the mammary gland, and she's not going to be a good milker for the rest of her life. So we restrict her growth, right, in order to optimize her milk production. With our beef calves, if we restrict them to 2 pounds a day, I would argue you have the potential to screw up that intramuscular fat deposition and limit adipogenesis, which is ultimately going to make less quality beef. So I would argue that, but the reality is this is a period that we still don't know a whole lot about. We think probably we should give these calves some forage. Dr. DiCostanzo just did a webinar with IMU University on this topic. So all their webinars are published on YouTube, so I won't go too in depth on this because Dr. DiCostanzo has done a great job calculating how much forage we need and when. We probably need a little bit less forage than we would traditionally think of for native cattle, which means ultimately we need a little bit more starch. But how much is too much? We still don't know. And when do we start pushing that starch? Again, Iowa State's doing some work on this. We definitely need more protein than we need in developing heifers because we're trying to grow muscle, and we really need to watch the amino acid profile, which is something in the cattle industry, whether it's beef or whether it's dairy, we don't do a super great job of. The dairy industry does a better job than the beef industry, but there are plenty of nutritionists in the beef cattle industry that are still formulating diets on crude protein only, right? When we know that animals require amino acids. So this is a problem that we're still dealing with in these beef on dairy calves. We also know that these animals eat a little bit strangely. So in beef cattle, we would typically manage those cattle to what we call a slick bunk. Very out of alignment with how we would manage a dairy, right? And a dairy, you want feed in front of that lactating cow all the time. In the beef industry, our beef cattle are most efficient if they're hungry when the truck pulls up, right? Now, we don't want that bunk to be slick for 4 hours before we feed them, but we want that bunk to be slicked up between an hour and 30 minutes before we feed them. However, if we do that with these beef on dairy calves, because they're sort of programmed in their head to eat like dairy cattle, what we see are more bloats, more acidosis, more nutritional upsets in those calves if we manage them like a conventional beef cattle. And so this is a real problem. John Beckett's a consulting nutritionist, and again, he millions of head of beef on dairy he feeds every year, and he said these Holstein progeny will look at a slick bunk and bloat just out of spite because there's nothing left for them to eat, and that cracked me up. So the point is, these animals are not developing heifers, they're not beef cattle. We have to treat them a little bit differently, but we have this really long post-weaning period that we have to manage, and how exactly we're going to do that becomes a conversation and honestly a little bit of an art. The industry is largely in agreement that we have to use technologies on these calves. And again, this is where we speak a different language, right? When you think of technologies in the dairy industry, you think of pedometers and milking equipment. In the beef industry, we think about things like growth implants and feed additives that are going to work to help increase the amount of muscle that we put on that animal. The challenge is, a couple of years back, the FDA changed how we can use those technologies. And so when we were feeding Holstein progeny only, we had the opportunity to put 3 or 4 implants in them. When an animal is on feed for almost 500 days and each implant only works for about 100 days, 4 implants are needed in order to take that animal all the way from birth to slaughter. But now we can only put 2 implants in. So most of the industry is back calculating the slaughter date and putting those 2 implants in towards the end of life. Again, I'm oversimplifying it. There's a lot of things we can do with implants and FDA terminology, but the reality is we can't do it the way we used to do it, and we still don't know exactly the right way to do it yet. One thing we're doing, whether it's beef on dairy or whether it's native cattle, and this was highlighted in the previous talk, is pushing those end weights, right? We know the goal is beef production. We know that the national supply of beef cattle is down. How are we going to maintain the supply of beef to meet that demand? Largely, we're doing it by adding pounds to the carcass. And we've been doing that for about the last 5 years. If you look year over year, those carcass weights just keep trending up and up and up. So carcass is a big deal. But because we feed these animals for a long time, the reality is that we have equations to predict carcass yield, but they probably don't really work for beef on dairy. And to be honest, most of those equations were developed decades ago and probably don't work all that great for our native beef cattle anymore either. And so I anticipate there will be continued conversations about yield equations relative to these beef on dairy calves. One of the largest conversations right now across the industry is on the liver abscess potential. This image I've highlighted, I've circled a scar. So this liver was condemned. This is a scar from where a liver abscess was previously. This liver being condemned is deemed inedible because of this little scar from where a liver abscess was previously. Now, each liver is only worth about $4. So simply condemning the liver, you're like, okay, $4 loss in carcass value. Maybe that's not a huge deal. However, livers abscesses are graded on a scale from this little scar all the way up to this abscess is huge. It's open, and so the abscess material has contaminated the carcass, and now we have to trim it. Because of this, the severity of the liver abscesses plays heavily into whether or not there's additional trim. And the group out of Texas has estimated that the annual costs of these liver abscesses across the entire beef sector, not just related to beef on dairy, is about $683 million. The challenge is that they are reporting right now that the native calf population, so native beef cattle, have a liver abscess incidence of somewhere around 15 to 20%. Dairy cattle, so purebred Holsteins, have an incidence somewhere around 20 to 25%. Beef on dairy cattle have been reported to have as much as 50%, meaning 50% of all the beef on dairy cattle going through the packing house have a liver condemnation or some sort of trim associated with that liver condemnation. So why these beef on dairy calves are more susceptible to liver abscesses or appear to be more susceptible to liver abscesses is a big issue facing the slaughter side of this industry right now, and one that continues to get a lot of USDA funding to support. Because we know that the liver is the powerhouse of the animal, right? It's in the liver where the animal is producing all the glucose it's going to use to meet its energy needs for growth and carcass composition. And if there is a liver abscess present, animals with a liver abscess will have reduced average daily gain. They'll have reduced hot carcass weights. And if those abscesses are adhered to the body cavity such that the carcass has to be cut away and condemned as well, then they'll have a reduced dressing percent. So this is a really big issue, not just for the slaughter industry, but also on the production economics of beef on dairy cattle fed in conventional systems. Now, TG Nakaraja is a researcher out of K-State, known for his research in the liver abscess world, and particularly on the microorganisms that cause liver abscesses. And he said, if we could get rid of Fusarium necrophorum subspecies necrophorum, which is the bacteria that we find most in these liver abscesses, we should be able to get rid of 95% of liver abscesses. But TG has been studying liver abscesses since the 1980s and has not yet found the curative agent for Fusarium necrophorum. So this is an issue that we continue to address. All right, so final thoughts. You all are in the business of beef production, whether you're raising beef from dairy or whether you're raising native beef cattle. And that's a good thing right now. Beef demand has not wavered in the last 20 years. It's been relatively constant. Those consumer prices that are being faced at the grocery store hasn't changed beef demand. People still want to eat beef. They still want that experience that they can only get with beef. You don't get the same juicy experience with a chicken breast. You just don't. And so folks continue to seek out beef. Every year we slaughter between 26 and 27 million head of cattle. Last year we only slaughtered 24.3, I think was the number. I have to double check that. Was less than 25 because the herd size is down. But we didn't change beef because we have beef supplied from dairy farms. Okay, so that's really important. Because of that, we need to continue placing emphasis on optimizing beef production from dairy progeny out of these systems. I have a lot of people that help me with everything that I do. And so I mentioned Dr. Bailey Basile. She's now at University of Vermont. Her co-advisor is Dr. Chad Deckow. Ingrid Fernandez is getting her PhD now, and her co-advisor is Melissa Cantor. And I've done research with UConn as well, and their master's student was Rachel Carter. So at this time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see all your smiling faces and ask if there are any questions.
Any questions for Dr. Felix?
As a dairy producer at heart, I get a little confused with, how we feed out, beef cattle with, the extremely high starch, diets. Like I know that there's always resource implications too, with how limited those can be. But I mean, if we feed, those beef animals getting fed out a higher digestible forage, I mean, shouldn't we be able to pull some of the starch out of it and have a healthier animal in the end too?
Hypothetically, however, you have to think about the way the whole system has transitioned since we built the Stockers and Packyards Act, right? So we have moved to a production system where 90% of the cattle fed for slaughter in the United States are fed in centralized feedlots. To bring forage into those feedlots, which is bulky, heavy, if it's wet forage, degrades really quickly, doesn't fit the supply chain that we've built, right? Think about silage as your example, right? Silage is 65% water. You can't pay $5 a loaded mile plus to ship water. But you can ship corn grain, which, oh, by the way, has far more energy than corn silage, and feed those cattle out with that corn grain shipped in on a rail car far more effectively. So it's, again, the title was Supply Chain Realities, right? That's the supply chain reality. It's what we've done, not just for beef, right? We've done the same things in hogs and poultry. We've disconnected those animals from the ground where their feed is raised. The reality of that is, though, again, if we're thinking about a conventional beef supplies chain, that animal still spends over half of its life consuming those forages when it's alongside mom at the cow-calf operation. It's just the last 200 days of its life when it's in the feedlot that in a conventional beef production system, it's fed the grain. The beef on dairy system, again, I think you're right. It's 500 days of heavy grain feeding, which is probably part of the issue. But the question still becomes, how do we marry those animals back to the land, though? Where is that land access? What's the fee we're going to charge for those grazing rights and all of these kinds of things? So it's a complicated question that you ask.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sort of along those same lines, do you know, is there any beef on dairy research that is happening in a grazing setting?
So I mentioned 3 papers. The third paper that was not out of my lab was from Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State, under the direction of Paul Beck, that was the corresponding author on that paper. They brought calves in from the wet ranch, and they split them so it was post-weaning, brought them in from the wet ranch, split them, put half the calves in on grass pastures and put the other half in grow out yards. And they claim no difference in final carcass value, et cetera, et cetera. However, those cattle that were grazed, those beef on dairy calves that were grazed, did spend longer time in the production system as a whole. So it's just, which is the nature of a grazing system, right? It's just going to take a little bit longer for those calves to grow out. But if you have the grass, again, it's an N of 1 right now, but their preliminary data would suggest that you can raise these animals in a grass-based system before turning them into the feed yard. It's interesting to me, I appreciate your question, because what I see happening nationwide is less of this, let's take the beef on dairy calves and put them on marginal grounds and graze them, and more of this, let's take the beef on dairy calves and integrate them like we would pigs or poultry and control those calves from birth all the way to slaughter so that we develop a system and a calf and a meat that we can market then as our product. This is happening right now in Nebraska. There's a brand new feed yard that Key Jim just, he expanded it before he even finished it, right? So he's going to have about 200,000 beef on dairy calves. They're using all Leachman stabilizer genetics, so they're controlling that calf from uterus, putting in similar genetics at the dairy farms, and then managing those calves from wet calves all the way through. Again, very similar to the way we would place broilers or hogs. It's interesting. It's very unlike any beef production system we've used to date.
Any other questions for Tara while we got her? I think she's gonna linger a minute and listen, but when we break for lunch, we'll probably lose her. I appreciate again, Tara, you joining us via Zoom. I think it's worked well. Nobody fell asleep, so
Good.
that's a good sign. Last call. Any questions for her? If not, we're gonna transition, and we're gonna hear from Taylor Burrell, on Stephanie's PhD student. Stephanie probably will not come up front, even though her name is on the flyer, because it's up to the student to present research. Okay, thank you, Tara. I'm gonna flip over Taylor to your slides, and we're ready. So if you want to come introduce yourself, and I don't have a clicker, so I am your clicker. And then just logistics wise, lunch is gonna be ready right after Taylor. And I'll talk about it in just a second. And then Curry Noble. There he is. Yeah, I saw him over here a while ago. He, maybe. Yes. Okay. Provided it will read on my computer. No offense, Brittany. Curry's gonna talk to us during lunch. All right. Hold that thought. Yes. Is it on? I don't know. Why not? Look at there. I don't have to be Vanna.
Like Brittany said, my name is Taylor Burrell. I'm Dr. Ward's PhD candidate. I'm really lucky that I got to go after Dr. Felix because I'm very fascinated for this.
Taylor's not the grad support.
But I'll be talking to y'all about rearing the beef on dairy crossbreeds and the automated feeders on the dairy farms. As we all know, there's beef side and the dairy side, where we've got our beef where they're weaned around 6 to 9 months after they're prep fed and grazed. But on the dairy side, we do that intensive milk feeding, and then they're weaned at around 2 months of age. Then we transition to grower or grazing, depending on the dairy farmer themselves. However, the question of the day is, how do you feed the beef on dairy crossbreed? Do you do it like beef? Do you do it like the dairy? Or is there a good in between that we want to focus on? Which leads me into my study. We were looking at how to raise those calves with the influence of beef and dairy and how they perform on the automated feeders with 2 different weaning practices. We did it here at Piedmont. Thank you for bearing with me last year. Our 2 different treatments are the conventional, which will be CON for the rest of this presentation, and extended time EXT. Our conventional is what's recommended by the automated feeder companies. It's age-based. They're generally weaned about 6 to 5 days of age. It's also called a 40 fit, depending on who you're talking to. But our extended time period, weaning protocol is a little bit different. We were looking at how we could wean those calves based on their solid feed intake or their starter feed intake. So the first 2 periods are the exact same as our conventional. However, once we get to period 3, we start weaning them off based on their intake, and it starts at about 1 pound. Period 2, once they hit 2 pounds, and then period 5 or 3 for the step down is when they hit about 6 pounds of starter feed intake for 3 days in a row is when we get to step them back down. With our milk intake, the black and the red lines are going to be our conventional calves, and step down number 1 is at about 45 days for those calves. You can start to see that little bit of a decline in their milk intake. Step down number 2 is at about 55 days, and then those calves are weaned off at 65 days of age. With our extended time period calves, they actually followed the conventional calves fairly closely with their milk intake all the way through until about that 55 day mark, where they actually kept drinking a little bit more than the conventional calves did. but you can still see that they have a steady decline throughout the rest of the trial. And they weaned at about 113 days-ish, depending on which one of the calves, because each calf was a little bit independent of each other. With our starter feed consumption, I'll remind you of those conventional step downs and weaning date. But before day 40, all of the treatments and breeds have about the same starter feed intake. It's just when we start to step down our conventional calves that they start to pick up on their starter feed intake. And then at about day 85 is when we started kicking those calves off the trial. We stopped having the conventional calves on there. But our extended time period calves did go all the way through 124 days. And the reason why there's a little bit of a drop off at the end of those lines is because we started picking calves off one by one, so there weren't as many eating. Now, looking at our growth performances, this is just body weight gain, average daily gain, and feed efficiency. Our body weight gain, the conventional calves were about 100 pounds less than our extended time period calves because they had 30 days less than the extended time. However, with our feed efficiency, they have the same feed efficiency with both conventional and the extended time. And our average daily gain was a bit higher in our extended time period calves. Now, we did a partial budget. This does not have overhead in it. It does not have labor, any of that. I did not have any of that information. But looking between the two, you can still see the average body weight gain is an extra 100 pounds. And so when you get down here to your feed costs per pound gained, those extended time period calves were cost less to gain a pound than the conventional calves do. So in the long run, it might be harder to get those calves up because you've got an extra 30 days on that extended time period, but you're spending less on feed cost per pound of gain. And at the end, these calves, the extended time calves did bring back a net return from feed costs, treatments, and vaccinations of about $100 extra per head. And again, I wanted to drive home that that body weight gain with our conventional calves stopping on the trial at about 85 days, whereas those extended time period calves just kept going. And that's that extra body weight gain that's kind of a good point to understand and try to figure out how we can keep that extended time period and get that weight gain. Takeaways, please remember, this is just pre-weaning data. I currently do not have post-wean. However, I am currently working on that over at Piedmont. I have 3 calves left. I should finish next month on that trial, and hopefully we'll have the 2 post-weaning diet protocols evaluated by next spring. And the biggest takeaway for today is, what should I do in today's market? According to my research, sell them quickly. But also you have to ensure the health of that calf. So making sure that they have adequate colostrum, like Dr. Felix said, and also making sure that they have the correct vaccinations so that when you start when you start selling them and they're getting transported, they have that adequate immune system to make it to the feedlot and thus into the meat industry. Any questions?
Yes. On your graph about feed intakes and starter intake, yeah, right there. Did you limit how much you offered them in those first 45 days to keep them under a pound, or is that just what they ate?
That's just what they ate. So they got up to, I think it was 10 pounds that they got to eat every day.
Okay.
And
did you start offering starter like immediately or at daily?
They started getting offered starter feed at day 7 once they got put into the group housing, because they were in hutches, individual hutches before that.
And you saw that basically all of them didn't start eating over a pound until well.
There were a few, I will say, there are a few outliers within the Holstein and Angus group in the extended time period that, like number 17, she ate a pound within probably 35 days.
You said they were all getting 2 gallons?
They're getting 24,
12 liters.
12 liters, yeah.
Okay.
I can't do it.
3.5.
Okay, well, that's all. Okay, thank you.
Y'all gonna let the PhD clean off of the, one question?
I might have missed it, but did you have?
No, so we don't keep calves, on the trial or in the data set if they are taken off for health concerns
Gotcha.
or, dietary reasons.
Is this all based on replacement powder, like the replacement?
Yes, it's a 20% fat. That being said, if you feed waste milk, I get a better return.
So Brittany's gonna go out and check on the status of lunch, so we can get on her email if anybody wants to send any messages off the side.
And I don't know if her bank account's open or not, but we can check that too, so. I will just follow up with some of the work that Taylor's doing here and what Dr. Felix mentioned earlier, the questions around the quality of the milk, which you kind of indicated there, Josh, is this was a 2820 milk replacer that we have been feeding in this auto feeder system, and it's the auto feeders that give us the opportunity to sort of mimic that extended period of weaning. If you're on a farm and you're feeding in bottles, 12 weeks out is probably not going to be recommended, right? I mean, you're going to lose your folks pretty quick. They're going to be real mad at you for feeding a calf for that long. But I think that some of the data that Tara presented and then some of what we have here too would indicate that when that market changes and when we start to see those per head prices drop below, I don't know what it's going to be, maybe if they get below $300 again, then raising those animals out locally, and especially if you have a market for freezer beef, then I think there's going to be some real opportunity there. But all right.
We're real close on lunch, maybe just some instructions, and then I didn't even think that. It's somebody else say grace, but anyway, welcome to class. Okay. So we got burgers. I think I don't know if you know that. We're eating burgers. They're setting up the food outside. I think there's salad, fries, burgers, fixins. There's dessert and drinks on the other table.
Our intention was to actually feed you Taylor's calves.
They're still standing.
They're still on the hoof, so unfortunately, I mean, we could do it if you're interested.
Yeah.
Rare.
It'd be a bit of a rodeo, but we did purchase local beef from 2 different producers, and so some of the burgers that you'll have today have a Jersey influence, and then some of them are straight beef. And so we'll get your opinions to see what you think.
Yeah, so that's part of the instructions for lunch. On the food tray, there's 2 insulated, there's 2 containers of patties. There's probably enough patties where you really want to take one of each and see if your palate can decipher the day. You go right ahead. But anyway, take your pick. We'll tell you afterwards which one you got. We're gonna let you try to see if you guess what you got. Either an all beef patty, all beef breed patty, or an all beef dairy cross patty, right? That's all it. Anyway, I think logistically that's it. So I will say thanks for the food, and then we'll just file out the door and get your plate. You'll probably want to come back in unless you're of a certain age and you really like how cool it feels out there. I've already had some folks like, too hot, too cold, but anyway, take your pick. We got warm and cool. All right, so let's back here. Or thank you for this day. I thank you for the people in this room and for the food outside, and may it bless our bodies. And thank you for the earth and all that its bounty provides. And that's it. Amen. Okay. God bless you. I'll be busy.
I was holding this now. Where you at, boy?
Straight up Angus animal. If you got it out of the second or the brown pan, that was a dairy influenced family.
they're all good, is what I know. Right? And, we're gonna do more and more of this with this dairy cross animal based on the market and how much, we can take over the beef. That's what I heard this morning. Okay, so while you're consuming, we got one more speaker who's gonna talk to us about quality management and, grading of these carcasses, okay? So Curry Nobles, Animal Science, 50 States.
Cool, thank you. So, see, every time I present at I never know if it's better to go before lunch or after lunch, but I guess we'll do during lunch. It's the best of both options. So, so like Brittany was saying, my name is Curry Nobles. I work in the animal science department at NC State, but I am not an animal scientist. I don't do a lot with the animals on the farm. My background is really in food science, and so the classes that I teach on campus are focused on meat processing and kind of understanding what happens when that animal, whether it's whatever animal it is, what happens to it once it gets to the processing facility, and then everything that happens after that. And so really my degrees are in food science. My background is more on the processing side. Done some work in food safety to understand sort of the regulatory side of things and how to make food safe. But I am housed in the animal science department, and my main role is teaching undergrads different classes focused on meat processing. So this is going to be pretty informal. I know you guys are eating. I'm going to ask you questions. You can feel free to talk with your mouth. Speak with your mouth full. That's not going to offend me. So this is just going to be a very sort of general overview of kind of understanding what meat quality is, specific obviously to beef carcasses. And we'll get into sort of the standardized carcass grading system that we have here in the United States, but also just sort of what quality can mean aside from that. And so, and at the end, we'll kind of talk just a little bit just about carcass fabrication and things like that. But I thought it was a great point that Dr. Felix brought up in sort of how she opened her presentation was she asked who the dairy producers were, who the beef producers were, and she said, well, no matter if you're a dairy producer, you're also a beef producer because you're producing food. And so that's kind of how I like to open all of my topics or all my talks when I talk to sort of agriculture or sort of producers. Is you might think of yourselves as a beef producer or a dairy producer. But at the end of the day, everybody is in the food business. Everybody is a food producer, and so that's kind of how I view things coming from my background in food processing. So that's just something to keep in mind, because at the end of the day, the goal is to serve lunch with somebody, no matter if that animal was an Angus animal or had dairy influence. That's the goal. So when just once again, this topic just kind of focused on meats or specifically beef quality. What comes to mind? Tenderness. It's definitely who likes more tender cuts versus less tender cuts. Here in the US, we prefer more tender cuts. So tenderness. What else? What else? Tenderness. What? Juiciness. Juiciness for sure. What else? Flavor. Marbling. So all of those things can kind of impact each other. Protein content. So getting a little bit more specific. So yes, understanding sort of the nutritional aspects of things. So those are all things that seems like you're associating with a higher quality product. What about on the other end? What about are there any lower quality attributes or things that you tend to avoid rather than seeking out in a product? Organs, yeah. So the actual source of that product for sure.
Liver most do you?
I don't. It's missing out, yeah. You can't say that too far. The more west you get in North Carolina, you gotta keep that down. So things like that, juiciness, tenderness, flavor, what can impact those characteristics, either on farm or in the processing facility. Stress, most definitely. That's something, especially once that animal gets to the processing facility and how that animal is handled, can have a huge impact on the finished quality of that. Obviously, kind of we talked a lot about just sort of the genetics, nutrition management, all of those things can have an impact on sort of the overall quality of the product. And then also, you think about your role as a producer, that might change how you view quality versus your role as a consumer. And so when you're going to the grocery store or going to whatever to buy a product, you might look at things different than if you were actually selling that product. And so all of those things can kind of come into play when we think about the overall sort of idea of quality. So really, meat quality it involves there's not a really strict definition of what quality is, because quality is based on the consumer. My version of quality is different than your version of quality. I'm going to look for different things, but it can all be sort of based on color, tenderness, fat, portion size, cost. Obviously, that can impact the quality of a product for sure. Nutritional value, and yeah, the meat quality or the quality of a product can have huge impacts both on things that occur on the farm. So from a genetics, nutrition, management perspective, that can have an impact on sort of setting that animal up and sort of building sort of the baseline of quality. And then once that animal gets to the processing plant, the animal handling, processing techniques, packaging style, all of those other things that are done once that animal gets to the processing facility can have an impact on the overall quality of that product as well. But really kind of my sort of a good way to think about quality is anything that a consumer values and is willing to pay for. So if somebody is willing to pay for a certain attribute, whether it's the color, whether it's the portion size, whether it's a labeling claim, an animal welfare claim, all of that is associated with the quality of that product. So quality can be a little bit nebulous to kind of define or quantify because it can encompass a lot of characteristics. But yeah, so once again, kind of the goal of when I say beef, I'm talking about edible protein. We want to go from a live animal to a chilled carcass that's going to produce a safe, high quality meat product for whatever consumer, whatever customer that we're providing that product for. So yeah, so going from that to that, that's the kind of goal of no matter if you're raising a dairy animal, no matter if you're raising a beef animal, that's the goal is to end up as an edible product that's going to provide nutrition for somebody. So yeah, so beef or meat quality, beef quality, kind of nebulous, but there are some ways to quantify and standardize it. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about now. So when I shop, I like to read labels because that's the best way to learn about your food and understanding what goes on is to read the label and kind of get a sense of what's in that food product or how that product is positioned. So this is a picture of a skirt steak. This is from Aldi. You can see I've got the red circle around there around USDA choice. What are those words signify? What's the importance of those words right there on the front of that package? Quality in what sense? So yeah, so we know USDA choice, that those words are connotating some aspect of quality that we're going to associate with that product. And so once again, we said quality is kind of hard to quantify. So what does that mean? Is it high quality? Is it low quality? Is it mid-range quality? And so yeah, so kind of the way that, at least here in the United States, that we try to quantify or standardize quality is based on USDA quality grades and the USDA quality grading system. So here in the US, beef carcasses they don't have to be graded, but they can be graded. Sort of the goal of carcass grading is we want to take a carcass and we want to separate it and distinguish it so we can label something as USDA choice to separate it against other products that might not have that same quality grade. And really, the carcass grading process, it kind of focuses on two different areas. We can assign a grade for sort of the palatability of that product. So basically, the consumer perception of how good that product is going to taste. Is it juicy? Is it tender? Is it flavorful? That's one big aspect of understanding and standardizing quality grades. And then also we can grade a carcass for yield, understanding of how much sellable meat products can the processor get off of that carcass. And so obviously that's important because that's going to determine more from the processor side of things. But yeah, how much meat can you get off of that carcass? So that's kind of USDA carcass grading from a beef perspective. We're going to be focusing on sort of the quality aspect of things and the yield aspect of things. So just kind of thinking in general, why is this an important concept, or how can this be important for the beef industry? Who here shops at Aldi? You're from New York?
Oh yeah, we have Aldi.
You have Aldi in New York. So Aldi in New York. So I took this picture at an Aldi where I live outside of Raleigh. That says USDA choice. If I went to an Aldi in New York and found this same product with USDA choice, different farms, those animals were probably processed in different areas. But if they both said USDA choice, that should connotate the same level of quality of that product. It's going to build consistency across the market just by saying USDA choice is going to be the same no matter where that animal came from, no matter how it was raised, no matter what the genetics are. If it says USDA choice, it's going to meet a baseline level of quality, no matter what that product is or where that product came from. And so this carcass grading from a USDA perspective, it builds consistency across the market to standardize the language and standardize sort of the consumer perception of what they're actually getting out of that product. And so just a little bit more, grading is a voluntary service. Just because you have an animal harvested does not automatically mean that carcass is graded. The processors have to pay the USDA to come in and grade that carcass. So the grading services are provided by USDA AMS, the Ag Marketing Service, which is different than the mandatory food safety inspections of making sure that that animal is healthy and wholesome and the carcass is not doesn't represent a food safety issue. So both of those services are done by the USDA, just done by different branches of the USDA. The food safety inspections are done by FSIS, the Food Safety Inspection Service. That is mandatory. Carcass grading, voluntary. USDA AMS, they grade a lot of agricultural commodities, beef, poultry, dairy, cotton, tobacco, fruits, vegetables. So at least here in North Carolina, there are currently, or as of the last kind of 2 years, 2 processing plants, Piedmont Custom Meats in Rockingham County and Mays Meats. They're out in the western part of the state. They are the only plants here in North Carolina that can grade beef carcasses. So most of the beef carcasses that are graded are processed at high volume plants out in the Midwest or Pennsylvania. Here in North Carolina, those are the kind of the biggest beef processors we have. And they're actually, they do a virtual grading program, which we can talk a little bit more about. So yeah, just kind of put things in perspective.
Are you going to talk more about that virtual program?
I can, yes.
Okay.
Yes. So once again, grading, USDA grades a lot of products. You're probably familiar with a lot of USDA AMS grades, whether you realize it or not. But if you buy butter, AA butter, I mean, well, you guys are dairy people, you probably know about that. I give this talk to a lot of different people, but yeah, dairy products, eggs, obviously beef. We're going to talk about prime. Poultry is graded, can be graded on a different scale. That USDA A grade, that's the poultry grade. Once again, all these voluntary services to once again separate your product, distinguish it among other products in the market. So yeah, once again, getting back to beef grading. So it's like I said, beef grades, beef carcasses can be assigned 2 distinct grades. They can get a quality grade, which is going to assess that first part of overall palatability. How good was that product from an eating experience perspective? So that we can get a quality grade, and then totally separate from the quality grade, we can get a yield grade. They are 2 grades. They're not related. You can get a quality grade and or a yield grade. You can get one, both, either. It doesn't matter. Because once again, both are voluntary. You don't have to get either one. And they're not related to each other. So we're gonna spend most of our time talking about quality grades because that's what most people are familiar with. So when you think about beef quality grades, how many grades are there? We've already talked about 2. We've talked about USDA Prime, talked about USDA Choice. That's 2. How many other quality grades are there, and what are they?
Select and standard.
Select and standard, so that we're up to 4. Are there any more than that? Cutter, canner. So there are technically there are 8 USDA quality grades. We have Prime, Choice, Select. Those are the top 3. So this Prime is the top quality. Choice is the kind of silver. Select is the bronze. Then we have Standard. And then after that, we've got Commercial, Utility, Cutter, and Canner. So technically, there are 8 quality grades that can be assigned to a beef carcass. In reality, if you go to a store, you go to a restaurant, you will only see Prime, Choice, or Select. So in reality, there are 8 quality grades, but technically 8, but in reality, you're only going to see 3 applied. We'll kind of talk about why that is, but those are the potential quality grades there. So when you think about Prime versus Choice versus Select, what differentiates, what factors go into determining the quality grade assigned to a product? What is that USDA grader going to be looking for to say, hey, this is a Prime carcass, this is a Choice or a Select carcass? Marbling, that's one of the factors that influences quality grade for sure. What else?
By area.
Ribeye area, actually, that doesn't impact the quality grade, that impacts the yield grade. So ribeye area, we don't care how much muscling that animal is from a quality perspective. That's concerned more with the yield. We got marbling and maturity. So basically how much intramuscular fat that animal has and how old that animal is. Those are the only two factors that determine prime, choice, or select. Those are the only two factors that determine the quality grade of that animal. There can be a few other things, just sort of the class of that animal can play into sort of the quality grade a little bit. But in reality, we're going to be looking at maturity, marbling, so the age of the animal, and then that intramuscular fat that we're going to measure just at one specific area on a carcass. So we talk about marbling and getting marbling in a lot of different muscles. But to assess the marbling and determine the quality grade, marbling is assessed at a very specific location and one location only for an entire carcass. And then based on that one snapshot, the entire carcass is going to get a quality grade just based on how much marbling is present in a specific muscle at a specific anatomical location. So first we'll talk a little bit about maturity, understanding sort of the age of the animal. So beef animal comes to a processing plant. How do they determine the age of that animal? How do the processor or the USDA grade, how do they know how old that animal is? Yeah, so basically you kind of have to think about it. Once that animal is slaughtered, it's going to be hanging on a rail. The USDA grader is going to look at the carcass there, and then they're going to use what they can see as indicators of how old that animal is. So they can look at the bone structure and they can look at the muscle structure, because that's all that's left once that grader is going to be looking at that animal. So things like teeth don't come up a lot in beef carcasses, but lamb grading, that's a big thing in lamb. But yeah, basically we can look at the skeletal structure of that animal, just like as people, as animals get older, their skeleton changes. Same thing with their muscles, so they can look at skeletal maturity and the lean maturity, and then their muscle and their bones change as those animals age. And so specifically with the bones, younger animals have a lot of cartilage, so that soft tissue. And then as those animals get older, that cartilage undergoes a process called ossification, where it turns into bone. And so basically, that you're not going to get a direct age a lot of times, or an exact age, but you can kind of understand based on how much ossification has occurred in specific anatomical areas. You can kind of understand the relative age of that animal just based on how much cartilage is present versus how much bone is present. And then same thing, lean maturity, the color and the texture of the animal's muscle changes as that animal gets older. And so basically the graders have sort of standards that they can look at and compare what they see to known standard ages of lean maturity and skeletal maturity. And so this is just kind of showing you the ossification process. One of the places where they look are sort of these rib caps, or sort of caps on these vertebrae here, called buttons. And so you can kind of see here in this younger animal, we see a lot of white caps there. That's because that's cartilage, and cartilage is kind of soft. And then as that animal ages, that cartilage fuses with these vertebrae here. And so you can see those buttons are no longer white because they're no longer cartilage. And so once again, we've got kind of not an exact age, but a younger animal versus an older animal. And so then based off of that, looking at the maturity, the animals get a maturity score that correlates to a chronological age. So really, most of the beef that's going to be graded or get a prime, choice, or select grade is going to have an A maturity. It's going to be somewhere between 9 and less than 30 months. The 30 months is kind of the signifier. Once it crosses that 30-month threshold, that kind of changes things from a regulatory perspective. So most of the prime, choice, select beef that's graded is going to fit in this A maturity. But you can see it goes all the way up to 96 months. So that's mature. So once again, as animals get older, the higher the maturity group, that's going to cause the quality grade to decrease. And then so the other aspect of quality grades is marbling. And so once again, marbling, we're going to look at how much intramuscular fat is present at a specific point on that carcass. And specifically, we're going to look at something called the longissimus dorsi muscle, or the LD muscle, which is basically, we're going to look at that muscle in between the 12th and the 13th rib. So beef carcasses, they have 13 ribs. That animal during processing is quartered into a forequarter and a hindquarter in between the 12th and the 13th rib. And that process exposes that longissimus dorsi muscle at that specific location. And so we look there at that muscle because that's a very important muscle that shows up in a lot of high value retail cuts that you get from a beef carcass. So the longissimus dorsi, it's the main portion of a ribeye steak, a New York strip steak, and then a porterhouse and a T-bone steak. It's the same muscle. It basically runs the length of the spine of that animal, and it's a important muscle, and so that's why we look at it for marbling. So that's the only place where we look at how much marbling is present is at that specific junction there. And so basically, they kind of do the same thing of what they did with comparing sort of to the standards. The USDA has marbling standards to show sort of the relative level of marbling. And so either a grader will look at that longissimus dorsi muscle right there and compare it to standards, or what's done in virtual grading is the processors open the carcass there to expose that muscle. They take a picture of it. They upload that picture to a USDA portal. And then within 24 hours, the USDA sends them back a marbling score based on the picture that they upload. So these are some marbling scores or official marbling photos to kind of show you this is the longissimus dorsi muscle there, cut at the 12th and the 13th rib. So the language is a little bit confusing because the highest point or the most marbling, it's only called moderately abundant, and then we've got slightly abundant, and we've got moderate, modest, small, and slight. And so you can kind of see, based on those marbling descriptions, moderately abundant, that's going to equate to a prime grade of marbling. You can kind of see that's prime. This is also prime. Even though they're the same grade, there are some variations within prime, choice, and select. So each one of those quality grades can be divided into thirds. And so you can see we can have a marbling score of low choice, average choice, or high choice. Same thing, we can have low prime, average prime, or high prime, and kind of differentiate those into thirds. But basically, that's exactly what we're looking at. How much marbling is present in that muscle at that specific location compared to these standards. And so then once we have that, we know the maturity of that animal, and we know the marbling score of that animal. And you come here to these sort of USDA quality grades chart, and you basically just kind of find where those 2 points intersect based on the maturity up here at the top. So once again, that maturity range of A to E. So we've got young animals here on this side, and then the degrees of marbling. So more marbling up at the top, less marbling there at the bottom. And so you can kind of see, to get a grade of prime, choice, or select, you either have to be relatively young, sort of in this A range of maturity, and you have to have some marbling present. And so then after that, you can kind of see the older the animals get, we're going to get more into the commercial utility and cutter, and then the less marbling that's present, we're going to get there into standard, and then kind of on there. Does that make sense? What other sort of conclusions can you draw from this chart here?
I got a really old fuller cow and have a choice carcass, but because it's so old, they're going to go into commercial.
Yeah, and so once again, you can kind of see here from as animals get older, even if they do have a high level of marbling, the older they get, the lower that grade is going to be. Just because as animals age, the palatability of that meat changes based on sort of the muscle structure of that animal. So keeping that in mind, we'll do a little prices right now guessing it here. So of the beef that is graded in the United States, what percent do you think grades prime, choice, select? So once again, not all beef that's slaughtered is graded, but of all beef that's graded, so of the 100% of beef carcasses that are graded, what percentage is prime, choice, select, standard? What do you guys think? We'll start with prime. What do you think the percentage of prime graded product is?
20.
20. Anybody want to go higher or lower? 40. 15. 5. All over the place. Prime, sits somewhere around 10%. So once again, this change, and this has significantly changed over time over the last 20, 25 years. Prime used to be about 2%. But I think this might be data from 2023, or about 10% prime. What about choice? So prime, obviously that's the kind of top end. Choice, that's the next level down. What percent grades choice? 20, 60? That's 75% grades choice. Okay. So the vast majority of beef that's graded probably going to get a choice grade. And so once again, so we've got 75 and 10, that's 85. So we don't have a lot of grading left. And really the rest of that is USDA Select. That's once again, my degrees are not in math, but that roughly adds up to about 100%. So like I said, there are 8 possible grades, but in reality, you're only going to see these 3 grades applied because it makes sense. If you took your animal to market and you knew it was either old or didn't have the genetics to have a lot of marbling, there's not a lot of consumer value in marketing a product that's USDA utility. No consumer really knows what that is or understands what that product means, especially if it's sitting next to something that's labeled USDA Choice, USDA Select, or USDA Prime. So those are the quality grade distribution. And once again, those have changed significantly over time based on the better understanding of genetics, better understanding of nutrition and management. I think back in the early 2000s, and you can go on the USDA's website, and they have historical grading data from when USDA grading started, like all the way back in the 1930s. But just based on the last 20 to 25 years, choice was about 50% and select was about 30%. So basically over the last 20 years, producers have gotten really good at producing higher quality beef to shift the grades more towards prime and choice and away from select and standard. You can go and find historical video.
What percentage of total beef do you think is actually graded? Like how much does that represent right now?
So the majority. So basically this is capturing sort of all the animals that are on feedlots are going to go to high volume processing plants in the Midwest, and the vast majority of those are going to be graded. So I don't know exactly, but I would say probably at least 80-85% of all beef slaughter in the United States is done under And so this is, like I said, here in North Carolina, we've got some smaller plants that can do this virtually, but that's just a relatively new program. So once again, just because a product is not graded doesn't mean that it doesn't have any value. And so once again, it's kind of understanding, especially if you're selling direct to consumer or if you're selling freezer beef, that product is probably not going to be graded. But once again, it's if your customer understands sort of how that product is produced, they might value the quality of that product coming off your farm or dealing with a farmer one-on-one, rather than understanding buying a product that's labeled as USDA Prime, Choice, or whatever. And then also, obviously, especially in the dairy industry, as those animals get older, just because you're dealing maybe with potentially older animals that might not qualify for a Prime, Choice, or Select quality grade, doesn't mean that those carcasses have no value, because as I think I came in sort of at the end of your presentation, but here in the United States, we eat a lot of ground beef. We eat a lot of processed meat products, processed beef in ground beef, in frozen dinners, in sauces, in sausages, that we just need protein for. It doesn't matter if that protein is Prime, Choice, or Select. There's a lot of value, a lot of uses in the processing space for product that is that is not graded or can't qualify for a high grade. And so really, Prime, Choice, and Select, those are going to be sort of limited to your whole muscle steaks, roasts, sort of things like that, either at a restaurant or sort of at a retailer. But everything else, ground beef, processed products, all of those things are going to be made from animals that are not graded or that are coming from a lower grade. Once again, doesn't mean that they're lower quality, just their value is different in what they're being used for. And so just to kind of show you, this is some example. I take a lot of pictures of stuff I see at the grocery store. So this is some USDA Prime London broil, which I think that came from an Earth Fair, or was it an Earth Fair grocery store, or maybe a Fresh Market? Let's see, you've got that USDA Prime shield there. London broil comes from the back, from the round of the animal, so it's a pretty lean cut anyways. Once again, it doesn't matter. We didn't assess the marbling there for this animal to get that prime grade. They only looked at the marbling in that longissimus dorsi muscle, and then every cut, every piece of meat off that carcass gets whatever marbling score is applied to that one specific location. So it doesn't matter if it comes from the round, the brisket, the chuck, the plate. If it's USDA Prime in that longissimus dorsi muscle, every animal or every piece of meat off that carcass gets that same quality grade. And then also prime grade ground beef. Once again, if you're buying a prime product, you're going to be looking more for a tender product, a juicy product. Once you put something through a grinder, everything's going to be tender. So I just think that's, you can certainly buy prime ground beef if you want, but it's just kind of a unique way to market products there. Questions? Yes.
Does the length of hang time impact your grade at all?
No. So hang time. So once again, the grading process is done as those animals are being processed in the plant. So basically, animal comes in, it's harvested today, it's going to hang in a cooler overnight to chill, and then tomorrow that carcass will be fabricated into all the primals we see here. And then once again, so that 12th and 13th rib interface is right there. So to separate the rib and the loin, that's where those carcasses are going to be graded. And that's done the next day. So then once it's graded, then what would typically be happen if you wanted to dry age or hang that carcass is you would hang or dry age just the specific primals for however long you wanted to, but they would already have that quality grade applied because that happens sort of in the flow of the process.
I work for a company that we do our own in-house grading.
Okay.
And just curious whether, if you've got a 2-week hang or a 3-week hang, would that potentially make any difference or should it not?
So no, because what you're looking at, the factors that influence the grade are the age of that animal when it was slaughtered, and the marbling that's present. So once that animal is harvested, those two things aren't changing. So obviously, dry aging and hanging can impact the quality in a much different way and produce a lot more unique flavors. But from a USDA grade perspective, it's not the amount of time that carcass hangs is not going to change. That's a good question, though. Other questions? So yeah, so just to kind of wrap things up. So that was all about quality grades. Like I said, beef carcasses can also be assigned yield grades, which is going to give you an estimate of how much meat is going to come off that carcass. And then the yield grade is calculated a lot more quantitatively. So basically, to get a yield grade, the graders are going to measure 4 different variables. They're going to measure the back fat thickness at that same junction where they measure the marbling at that 12th and 13th rib interface on the longissimus dorsi muscle. And so that back fat, that's basically going to give you an estimate of the external fat of that animal. We're going to measure the ribeye area. So once again, at that same place, the 12th and 13th rib on that longissimus dorsi muscle, that's going to give you an estimate of just the overall muscling of that carcass of that animal. We're also going to take into account the hot carcass weight, just how much did that carcass weigh after the slaughter process. And then the last variable is something called the kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, which is sort of the internal fat around sort of those internal organs there. And so basically, all of those get a number, plug them into this equation, and it will spit out a yield grade from 1 to 5. And so yield grade 1 is the highest yielding carcass. So that's going to be sort of that lowest fat, heaviest muscle, going to give you sort of the highest yield, most meat from that carcass, all the way up to a yield grade 5 is going to be the higher fat, smaller muscle, lower yielding carcasses. So once again, consumers, this is not really something consumers are concerned with. This is more from a processor and understanding how much they're going to get back off that carcass. So yeah, quality, it's in the eyes of the consumer. Understanding what you want is different than what I want, different than what if you're selling to a restaurant or an institution. They're going to be looking at things a lot differently than an individual consumer is. But USDA quality grades are a great way to standardize sort of how we talk about beef quality across the industry. And then, yeah, just because a product doesn't have a grade doesn't mean that it doesn't have any value. And it just doesn't have that sort of USDA sort of connotation there. Questions? Yes.
From a palatability or I guess maybe a muscle structure standpoint, does freezing beef have anything to do with any of that? Like we sell a little bit of beef out of the freezer. The lady at my wife's work, she stated that she didn't want it because it turned and froze. So from a quality standpoint, is there any changes that actually happen in that process?
So if you freeze it basically too fast, if you freeze it right after that animal is harvested, because meat is different chemically than living muscle tissue. That's kind of once an animal is killed, is slaughtered, there are a lot of chemical changes that go from taking that muscle, which is a living, functioning muscle tissue, and turning it into meat, which is from the muscle, but they're different chemistries. So if you freeze it too quickly, there can be some quality differences. That's more than likely does not happen. So once that animal, like I said, beef comes in today, harvested, it's going to chill for at least 24 hours. That's going to allow that muscle to change to meat. Once that meat is fabricated, frozen, no. As long as most frozen products are stored inside of vacuum package bags, as long as the package is sealed and that product has stayed frozen, that's the best way to preserve the quality of the product for a long period of time, is to freeze it inside of a vacuum package. I've got stuff in my freezer that's been vacuum packaged and frozen for 2 years. I'd take it out and use tomorrow, and the quality would be the same. Good question.
You know,
Yeah, yeah. But no, I mean, that's freezing in a vacuum package bag is sort of industry standard for preserving quality for a long period. Good question. Back to that.
Thanks.
Are there? Yes. And so this is and so when you can kind of see if it's got a plus in front of it, that means it's going to drive the yield grade up, which is bad for the processor. So really you can kind of see the only thing that lowers the yield grade is the ribeye area. And so once again, from a processor standpoint, you want to sell muscle, you don't want to sell fat. And so ribeye area, that's the only factor that is directly correlated to the muscle.
What's the 30-month cutoff for?
So basically, after 30 months, as those animals get older, that's been proven to have a higher risk for the causative agent of mad cow disease. And so after 30 months of age, the tissues where that causative agent, that prion, can live in the nervous tissue in the brain, those tissues have to be treated differently. And so that's just kind of it's more of a food safety issue than a quality issue. But that's kind of, at least here in the United States, we've said once an animal gets above 30 months of age, there's a higher risk of passing along mad cow disease. And so that's kind of the cutoff.
And the thing that means is they're going to take the SRMs out. So it doesn't change anything. They remove the spinal cord, the eyeballs,
Yeah.
That's the only thing that.
Yeah, so it doesn't change the quality of the meat, especially if you're dealing with a small processor. They might not want to do that or have the manpower to do that. So they might say, hey, if an animal is over 30 months of age, we don't have the manpower to deal with that. And so really that's why that kind of because it doesn't mean that product is unsafe. As you said, that the SRMs is specified risk material. So things like the spinal column, the parts of the brain, eyeballs, things along the nervous system have to be kind of treated differently. Good question. Other questions?
And one more really.
Yes.
Who pays for grading them?
The processing plants. So once again, that's a voluntary service. So if they want to offer that service, they have to pay the USDA to come in and grade it. And so there's a specified schedule of how much it costs. And so really that was one of the big reasons why in North Carolina we didn't have graders before the virtual grading, because you have to pay for the time of a USDA grader to be in your plant whenever you're operating. So it's really expensive unless you're dealing with a very high volume, sort of large throughput processing plant. But with the virtual grading, basically that the USDA came out and trains the Piedmont customer Maze Meats and shows them how to take the picture, shows them what to do. They have to pay like a yearly fee, but it's much less than having to pay for somebody to be on site every day. But yeah, so it's voluntary service. So the processor is going to pay for the USDA to come in.
And is yield grade, can yield grade be done virtually as well? And need small measurements.
That is a good question. I don't know. Probably. But honestly, now what happens in large plants is there's a USDA grader there, but basically everything now is once that carcass is ribbed, they take a computer takes a picture of that 12th and 13th rib interface, which captures the marbling, and then it also captures the ribeye area and the back fat thickness. And so basically it takes a picture, that picture is kind of fed in, and everything is done computer graded, and then the person just there and they can make adjustments if they see something that the computer missed, something like that. But that's how things are done in large plants now. Good question.
Well, I just wondered if you mentioned like the changes in distribution between Prime, Choice, and Select over time. What's is there one, and I guess what does it look like, the feedback to the producers to make the change? Like on the dairy side, they find out real quick if their milk quality is not where it's supposed to be. But on the beef side, there's so many stops that carcass is gonna make while it's still on the hook. How does that get back around?
Yeah, I don't know if that's sort of coincided because somebody mentioned Certified Angus a little while ago. And so if you go onto the Certified Angus website, there's a lot of overlap with the quality grades, quality grade distribution. And basically to be a Certified Angus, you obviously have to have the Angus genetics, but you also have to be in the top 2/3 of USDA choice. There's also some things that play into the yield grade that kind of come into that. So I don't know if that's, because I know that program has risen in popularity a lot in the last 20-25 years. So there could be some there, but it could just be sort of with the genomic advancements and understanding sort of the more EPDs available. But yeah, as far as the specific, because there's no like testing or there's no sort of like there is in the
Back to the grower basically, and then non-integrated system.
Yes. And so, yeah, I don't know the specific answer to why things have changed, but they definitely have shifted from lower quality, leaner products to Choice Prime, a lot more marbling. That's kind of the shift due to genetics, nutrition. Yeah.
Farmers are good at what they do.
Yeah, Shannon?
Yeah. So based on all of this, again, grading beef can get kind of complicated. What do you see as the major misconception most consumers have when they're going and looking at the case and help?
Yeah, so just because it has a higher quality grade doesn't mean that it's gonna be better. Because once again, this is a USDA Prime London Broil, still pretty lean. So if you try to cook this like, if you said, USDA Prime, I can cook it like New York strip, I can cook it like a filet, you're probably gonna have a poor eating experience with that product. And so somebody mentioned tenderness. We didn't have time to get into that. Tenderness can also impact the quality of a product. And just because you start with something that has a perceived lower quality or lower value, if you know what that muscle is, where it came from, what that muscle did for the animal, you can cook it and treat it to get a much better eating experience than you might realize. So, and also a lot of things, marketing, especially when it gets to aging and sort of other things, just because it appears on the label doesn't mean that it means anything. And so that's what I try to, so like USDA Prime, sourced from top tier ground beef. What does that mean? Top tier.
On the top of the truck.
Yeah, top tier. Yeah. So there's a lot of this one, London Broil, hand trim, aged for tenderness. Aged for how long? What does that mean? So there's a lot of not misleading things, just a lot of words out there that the average consumer might not know what they mean, or they might not mean anything. So understand where the muscle came from. Did it help that animal move around? or did it help support the skeletal system of that animal? That's going to be the biggest thing of kind of understanding, getting the best quality of that product, no matter how much marbling, no matter how much fat is there to begin with. Good question. Any other questions? Cool. Yes, if you got questions, there's my email. So.
Okay. Well, thanks again for being here. I'm gonna put these Everag handouts up here on the front table. Don't forget if you wanna grab them or just take a picture, save the paper and QR code. Vote on the 2020 on 6. The recording for this session, along with the other 2 webinars that we did as part of the Winter Run Bank series, they are posted on the Dairy Portal. This one will be as soon as I get it downloaded and all that. Slides will also be posted there. So if you're not receiving the Dairy Portal newsletter, you only get something if we posted it. Go sign up for it, and then you'll get notified when those are posted. Again, don't forget, March 4th is the deadline for STBII applications, bringing those to be in the room that are interested. You weren't here when I announced that, March 4th for you 2 ASAs, that's the deadline, 5 p.m. online permission again. Okay, and I think that's it. I'm gonna stop this recording. Speakers are still here for a minute. I think we are gonna convert to a research and extension working group meeting.
Yeah.
So if I were you, I'd get out of here. Yes. Have a conference, February 20th. Yeah, actually, Harry, Nancy Cattleman, go ahead and stand up to that, extension group in the back, yakking. They're always the boss. I know. Everybody's welcome to North Carolina Cattle Conference, February 21st. We're still finalizing the agenda, but we're excited to share. We'll have a new meeting with our opening keynote speaker and a lot more good topics, farmland preservation, direct